Good morning and welcome to the 16th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can we please ensure that all mobile devices are switched to silent? And this morning I welcome back to the committee Mercedes Villalba for the item 1 on the agenda. So welcome. So we turn to our first item on the agenda, which is consideration of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill at Stage 1. And at today's meeting, we'll take evidence from a panel of environmental NGOs. And I welcome to the meeting Ria Chris from Open Seas, Callum Duncan from the Marine Conservation Society, Dr Nick Hesford from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, Dan Paris from the Scottish Environmental Link, Nikki Sinclair from Action to Protect Rural Scotland, Elise Watt from RSPB and Bruce Wilson from the Scottish Wildlife Trust. We've got about 2 hours allocated for the discussion, and it seems a long time. We've got an awful lot of questions and a lot of witnesses. So can I ask everybody to try and be succinct in their questions and answers? And there will be some questions that just warrant a yes or a no response. Please indicate to the clerk or to myself if you wish to participate, but there's no expectation that everybody will participate in every question, or 2 hours would not be adequate. Likewise, if you feel that part of the discussion doesn't relate to your area of expertise, don't feel that you need to answer. Also, just to remind you, you'll not need to operate your microphones. We've got a gentleman here that will do that for you. So we'll just kick off with a nice, easy question, and it's whether you support the introduction of statutory biodiversity targets, and if so, what impact do you expect these legal targets to have in practice compared to the approach we have at the moment? And are you actually satisfied that these targets should be set in secondary legislation? Who would like to kick off? Dan.
Thank you, Finlay, and thank you for inviting us to the committee today to discuss this piece of legislation. Scottish Environment Link is strongly supportive of the introduction of statutory nature targets. This is something which we've been pushing for as a network for a number of years, and we're delighted to see this legislation introduced and have the opportunity to discuss it today. It is, of course, not targets themselves that will drive change, but the actions which follow and the actions which are already underway. But targets can play a vital role in the restoration of nature. Targets can play an important part in creating long-term policy certainty and a shared level of ambition across government and wider society, including NGOs, but also private landowners and other actors. It can also drive government action across portfolios and across different public bodies. And importantly, it can create a cycle of monitoring, reporting and accountability, which will be important as time moves on. We get closer to the meeting of those targets, and we want to see we want to ensure that Parliament is able to hold government accountable to progress against them. The detail of the targets is something that we can probably discuss, but in terms of the setting under secondary legislation, we are comfortable with that. We produced a report in advance of the bill being published, which did recommend a very similar structure to what is in the legislation, with a compulsory target set in the bill and through the Act, and then the metrics and the details set under secondary legislation. That's important because biodiversity is inherently more complex than climate. Under climate, it's easy to create one single metric, and so to have a single target. Biodiversity is never going to be as easy to simplify and to put something on primary legislation which would stand the test of time, which would stand progress and stand through changes to scientific understanding as well. So we are broadly happy with that structure, although I'm sure we'll come to the detail of what those targets might include later in the discussion.
And Open Seas have been publicly critical of the past attempts with the government to stick to legal targets. What's your position on these natural environment targets?
Yeah, good morning, committee, and stealing my thunder a bit. But yes, you're absolutely right. First of all, I'd like to start by saying that we do agree with what Dan was saying, that targets are only as good as the actions that follow it. But in terms of the marine environment, our main concern is that if the government had been committing to its policy commitments and its legal obligations, we wouldn't necessarily need targets. One of our main concerns is that the Scottish Government claims that it has world-leading record on marine protection. So it says that it has 37% of the marine areas designated, and these were designated 10 years ago, but they still don't have any fisheries management. So our concern is that actually about less than 5% of Scotland's coastal seas are protected. And so for us, we obviously aren't going to, we are supportive of the targets, but for us, having seen the record in the marine environment where the Scottish Government considers its job done, when it really hasn't, and it has now we're rolling onto an 11-year delay, we really want to use this opportunity of the bill. First of all, as we're saying, targets need to have actions behind them, but we also want to know what is the accountability that's going to happen if the targets are missed. Because as we can see with the marine environment, 10 years is a delay way too long.
So in practice, how do you think there's going to be a difference in just a policy approach to legally binding targets?
Well, I think in the first instance, one of the good things about targets is not only does it galvanize people, but having legally binding targets also ensures that biodiversity or climate change or marine won't be politically deprioritized, that this is something you can hold the government to account. But as I said, I would really welcome further scrutiny and exploration into how, if the targets are missed, that accountability is going to be rolled out. Either from the Parliament or within the legislation itself.
Thank you. Elise.
RSPB Scotland takes the same position as Lincoln. We're wholly supportive of the introduction of statutory targets. I think it's really important to recognise that in Scotland 1 in 9 species are now at risk of extinction, and we're now amongst the most nature depleted countries on the planet. And there have been some successes with conservation, but on the whole, the voluntary approach to reversing biodiversity loss hasn't been working, and I think you could take the position that the Scottish Government has missed some of its targets and commitments in the past, but I think that's why it's so critical that we have statutory targets that can really drive progress towards the ambition of the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030, and we'll probably come on to the detail and the governance later, but I think the bill is quite good at building in accountability and kind of oversight with the role of Environmental Standards Scotland to kind of really help ensure that targets deliver and that there are actions underpinning that.
Thank you. I've got Nick and then Bruce.
In agreement with the RSPB and with Link. And we support the principle of statutory targets and a stronger framework for nature recovery, but GWCT believe that the success of these will depend strongly on how they're implemented. I think statutory targets need to be adaptive and evidence-based because, as Dan mentioned, unlike things like carbon emissions, biodiversity is very complex, it's very difficult to quantify, and poorly designed or inflexible targets risks failure or unintended consequences. And so statutory targets should be, in GWCT's belief, supported by robust monitoring frameworks and adaptive management cycles. They can't be over-rigid or overly simplified.
Thank you.
Very quickly, the first draft of the biodiversity strategy really nicely identified within the evidence summary that the big failure so far on biodiversity in Scotland has been a failure to mainstream. So very simply, the Scottish Wildlife Trust want to see that driven, and we think targets can help there.
Okay, thank you. Callum.
We would like clarity that the bill does apply to Scotland's marine area, notwithstanding many of the concerns that Ria has raised, which we share. About 200 of Scotland's 233 MPAs still do not have fisheries protection measures in place. You're talking about most of Scotland's continental shelf. Something like 15 or 16 of the inshore sites got measures in 2016. And there's some de facto protection from the deep sea access regime beyond the continental shelf limit, deeper than 800 metres, but practically nothing in statutory terms for the entire continental shelf. We think targets would help ensure that the broader ambitions that are set out in the habitats regulations and the marine strategy regulations are met, and they're met in relation to the condition and extent separately of actually individual habitat types. But there needs to be clarity that this bill extends to the purview of the Scottish Parliament, and conservation is executively devolved to 200 nautical miles, as you know.
Okay, thanks. Is there any thoughts on the actual targets being set in secondary legislation? Bruce.
I'm not a massive fan of framework bills quite a lot of the time, but with this bill, I do think with the complexity issue that's been mentioned, it is necessary here because of the massive variability within biodiversity. So basically this time I think it's the option we choose.
Okay, Bree.
I would just add to that there should really be as much parliamentary scrutiny as possible. So I take the point of everyone else saying about the complexity and needing secondary legislation, but there is ways of doing secondary legislation that still affords the Parliament more scrutiny. So as a bare minimum, it should be affirmative, and if not, perhaps considerations of some shape or form of a super affirmative.
Okay, thank you. A question from Mark Ruskell.
Can I just go into a bit more depth then about the targets, and in particular the topic areas that were selected within the bill? There are obviously some topic areas that have been parked, I suppose, you could say, like ecosystem health and integrity. The government might come back to that. Other target areas, topic areas such as finance, for example, citizen engagement, that were not explicitly included within the bill. So I'm interested in your thoughts on what is in the bill, topic areas, what was left out, what the government might work on at a later date. Who would like to go first? Dan, okay.
So broadly, what the bill says is that the government must set at least 3 targets across species, habitat and other environmental conditions, but empowers the government to bring forward a much wider range of targets, both within those topic areas and beyond. Broadly, we're reasonably comfortable with some caveats. I think under habitat, as Callum mentioned, the target does say the condition or extent of any habitat, and I would assume that officials would be bringing forward targets that would cover separately the condition of habitats and the extent of habitats, which are both very important and must be measured separately. But I think it would be helpful if the bill actually specified those as separate targets rather than a condition or an extent. Under species, the language in the bill is the status of threatened species. Now, threatened species, I think for many in the conservation sector, would have a very specific meaning. It's very important that when setting these targets, we don't draw them so narrowly as to be measuring only a selection of the natural environment rather than the natural environment as a whole. So we don't want to, a really cynical reading of this is that you could meet the requirement to have a target on the status of threatened species simply by setting a target that covers a small number of charismatic or well-known species which are at risk. It is important that the species targets cover not just those that are most threatened, but those that are widespread but in decline or could go into decline in future. Now, actually, the policy memorandum's definition of threatened species is one which we would be comfortable with, but the policy memorandum isn't the legislation, and just that language of threatened species, I think, could be more encompassing of the wider species targets that we need to include. There are other things that we
need. So how does that then relate to ecosystem health and integrity? Is there a wider perspective on the target that goes beyond individual iconic species that you want to see? Or
there are additional targets that we would like to see added in, ideally. We would like to see a target that covers the reversal of biodiversity loss against a historic baseline, so that we're not just measuring biodiversity against what's happening in 2025, but actually with a much longer ecological timescale built into it. We would like to see a target that looks at ecological connectivity in particular. So we think about this in terms of a national nature network, where we can I don't want to have a situation where we're restoring nature but it still remains fragmented. We want to bring it across the landscape and into communities across Scotland. And we do think that there is a case for a specific target on the condition of designated features as well at protected sites.
Okay.
Yeah, within the bill, there's the sort of catch-all at the end, any other matter relating to restoration or regeneration of biodiversity, which might consider appropriate, where you could put some of these things. But if it's not on the face of the bill itself, I think there's a risk that we might miss some of that ecosystem health stuff that you were referring to. I think that is quite important. I was listening with interest the last session that you had on this. I think there were some really excellent points made around why that is so important for the broad understanding of biodiversity. I do think there is also scope in here to tie this to some other measures that we have. So I have had discussions around maybe inclusion of something like the Natural Capital Asset Index, which would give an idea of the relative benefits of the ecosystem services are giving to people. Those would be other things that would help not only add a diverse range of data sets, but also make it relevant across different government departments as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you have thoughts then on the omission of a target for finance?
Yes.
Define good finance.
Yes. I think there was, I think I'd noted some concerns about greenwashing previously, but I am, without having the money to back this up and a kind of route to that, I would be concerned about our ability to meet some of these targets. So I think on balance, I would probably like to see that in there.
Okay. If there's any other views? Or... No? Yeah, Carl.
As members of Link, we support everything Dan said and sign up to the response on that. It was just to bring a marine dimension to some of that. In terms of ecological connectivity target, I think that would apply at sea as well. The way the Marine Act is drafted, we're pleased that there's a range of sites at sea, although we're still awaiting for measures for those, as I've said. Particularly concerned about the delays for the remaining inshore measures. But the Marine Act currently, as drafted, it requires replication of sites and representation of sites, but it doesn't have a legal connectivity target. So I think that would be a useful element to bring into it. So just for the committee thinking about that connectivity still is an issue at sea. And just to underline the point about the historic baseline and bring a marine dimension to that. We've submitted evidence before, of course, about the concern about declines. Most of the seabed health is in poor condition, declines in kittiwakes, harbour seals, salmon, etc. So, there's a lot of data out there. I'm emphasising that because the Biodiversity and Intactness Index, which is a useful metric, doesn't yet have marine data, but there's a lot of marine data, including that which I've submitted to committees before, which underlines the concerning and poor status of the marine environment. I just wanted to underline that.
Yeah. Okay.
Swishat.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. The bill would require Scottish ministers to seek scientific input on the targets when developing regulations, but it doesn't require wider public consultation. So what's your view on that, taking into account the role your organisations might have in supporting implementation of the targets? I don't know who might want to go on that first.
So, as a scientific organisation, we're very much supportive of the idea that these targets are built on evidence. But equally important is the monitoring of that, and that needs to be data-led as well. One area which, and it's ambitious to do that, and one area which I think is important to consider is the ability of practitioner-led monitoring through understanding these targets, and it's something that the GWCT have been engaged in across Scotland in Empower, and we need to be able to look within this. We would see the Natural Environment Bill as an opportunity to help empower those who manage our land. That's sort of 70% of Scotland is managed by landowners and farmers, to not only feed into the monitoring process through the data gathering, but also through delivering that biodiversity on the ground. If we don't engage with that 70%, then achieving these, quite frankly, ambitious targets will be just unachievable. And so I suppose within that, we would like to see within this bill the opportunity to introduce funding for facilitation to deliver landscape scale approaches, which would include things like farmer cluster. And we've seen through our work in the south, where we have over 1 million acres of farmland stewardship delivering for biodiversity in England, And that approach in Scotland would be really welcome. And I think a very useful tool to be able to deliver biodiversity at scale, but also to be able to ensure that we're monitoring that biodiversity and our progress towards those targets.
Anybody else?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd say I think it's absolutely right that there's a requirement to seek and have regard to scientific advice in the development of targets, and the policy memorandum outlines that that's at least in part to be fulfilled by the programme advisory group. So I would say on the kind of public participation and transparency point that there should be kind of transparency in the advice that's coming out of that, so that there can be public confidence and kind of insight into how that advice is being given and how the targets are being developed.
Just on that basis, should there be in the face of the bill a requirement for the government to seek advice further than just scientific advice and actually look to practitioners and the public to respond to some of that advice?
Yes, I think without engaging with practitioners, people who are essentially delivering for biodiversity on the ground, then it's just it wouldn't be possible to meet those targets.
Okay, Ria.
Yeah, I think if we look at the actual wording within the bill, which just says such persons as the Scottish Minister is considered to be independent and to have relevant expertise, I think that wording can be tightened up. So I appreciate that you don't want to be too prescriptive, but if you look at something like the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009, which has a bit of a tighter wording around who should and shouldn't be, I think that could definitely be tightened up. So either, I mean, I fully support what everyone else on the panel has said about scientific advice and transparency of where that advice is coming from, but I think the way the wording is now is kind of in the gift of the Scottish ministers who they consider to be appropriate to consult or not. And so I think the wording can definitely be tightened up to make that more clear.
Okay. Thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. I've got a question for Ria, but I'm sure that others will want to jump in as well. Around the biodiversity targets, there are obviously quite a few parallels with current climate targets, and I wondered if you have any thoughts about what lessons should be learned straight off when building that framework for the biodiversity targets.
One thing I would raise is that if you look at new inserted section 2C subsection 2B, which says specify the manner in which or indicators against which progress towards an achievement of the target being set is to be measured, to me that kind of reads a bit as someone marking their own homework. And I think, again, we could learn from the Climate Change Scotland Act that you could do something akin to Section 2B, which is a target setting criteria. So again, you know, I hear what my colleagues are saying about not being too prescriptive in terms of the targets and leaving some flexibility to secondary legislation, but I think there can still be a bit more frame put into this framework bill, a bit more indicators of what direction should be going, shouldn't be going. So I would say that's one of the biggest things. And then the other thing as well is that I think it's really important that climate change targets aren't inevitably pitted against biodiversity targets. They actually need to work together, and actually aligned, they will both achieve what they want to achieve.
And how would you achieve that then? Because presumably there will be times where there is conflict. How should government and other bodies react to that?
I mean, one thing I would like to see in the bill, and one of the things Open Seas would like to see, is an equivalence of the kind of citizens panels. And I guess maybe it's a bit what everyone else was saying before about scientific evidence, about hearing from a broader range of people. I think that allows for a wider range of voices to be heard and views to come into it in the public, in the public and in transparency. So something akin to a citizens panel, or something, you know, akin to kind of short-term task groups to be able to bring their expertise and their advice in order to bottom this out and advise the government on how to move forward. But keen to hear what others have to say.
And kind of in terms of taking that forward then, how do you think we could better mainstream in terms of getting different government departments to then work together towards those common goals informed by a group or someone else?
I think one of Open Seas' concerns, I mean, this is particular to the Marine Directorate, but I can appreciate it probably happens in other government departments, is that there are a lot of strategies and plans at the moment, and sometimes they're at cross-purposed or siloed from one another. And so therefore you might have a duplication of effort or missed opportunities of kind of a holistic approach. I mean, just for a start, for the marine environment, you know, just to give an illustration of all these things, you know, you have the Future Fisheries Management Strategy, the National Marine Plan, Inshore Fisheries Management Programme, 21 fisheries management plans. There's the Biodiversity Strategy, the Seabird Plan, the Marine and Coastal Restoration Plan. I think, I mean, we would like to maybe see an amendment in this bill that there's concerted effort to kind of have a, you know, whether it be Environmental Standards Scotland, have a review of all these plans to see, you know, the efficiency of how they're working and maybe streamline things a bit and actually encourage more holistic working between departments. And whether that's a case of like they need to be resourced or maybe a bit of creative, you know, instead of having siloed departments, maybe you mix the departments a bit up. Because I do just think that the policy landscape is getting very complex and confusing and not transparent. So even for those within it trying to navigate, it's very hard to try to achieve what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is about the, you know, ultimately, I would say that the climate targets have been successful in effecting a kind of paradigm shift from where we were on climate to, you know, where we now are in Scotland. They've been very successful in that regard. So I would like to see similar with nature. And a lot of the processes for considering multiple options and things, to my mind, already exist. So you take something like the land use strategy, which is maybe a parallel to what you were talking at Syria. It doesn't have any teeth. No one is really interested in it. It has no real impact on the agricultural reform process, on any kind of land use planning decisions. It just kind of sits there, and it's a very, you know, it's a very useful tool, but it doesn't have any hierarchy. My hope would be something like the targets would really reinvigorate interest in that and help drive consideration of multiple land use at scale, or you know, embedding the ecosystems approach, kind of like with the marine environment. So I think that the real lesson I take from the climate targets is it does have the power to really give things a boost and ensure that mainstreaming.
I completely agree on the need for climate and nature goals to align, and that's what good planning should deliver. I mean, just for full transparency, we were part of expressing concerns about the Berwick Bank offshore wind farm, for example, but if you've got a good consenting process, you then can unlock other opportunities for offshore wind by getting it in the right place. And the fact that 152 million tonnes of carbon estimated are stored in the top 10 centimetres of Scotland's seabed illustrates and underlines the importance of and the opportunities for getting good results for climate mitigation as well as biodiversity by having an appropriate amount of marine habitats protected. That really underlines that. Currently, it's only something like 2.7% of inorganic carbon and 1.6% of organic marine carbon are protected in the Marine MPA network. So I just want to give that as an illustration of sort of climate and biodiversity side by side. But to point to a specific opportunity to help streamline and join up these processes, it might also be prudent to amend Section 5.3 of the Marine Scotland Act in relation to national marine planning, so that the National Marine Plan has policies that require the National Marine Plan to meet the targets that are set. Well, both the primary targets particularly if we separate extent and condition, but also the secondary targets that then come out from that. That's what the National Marine Plan should be doing. It should be delivering the greatest good, public good from the use of our seas whilst driving improvement in the status of nature. So I think there's an opportunity there to for the Natural Environment Bill to improve the National Marine Plan, and it's in its process of being updated at the moment.
I'd say one of the lessons we can probably learn from the climate legislation is that we can't legislate to guarantee good outcomes. So what's really important when we have a bill like this in front of us is that we take the opportunity to make sure the framework is robust as it can be, but also that we do look for those opportunities to mainstream the delivery. Now, one of the things which we could do relates to the biodiversity duty. So the bill is introducing targets as an amendment to the Nature Conservation Act 2004, which is where currently the biodiversity duty sits, as well as the requirement to produce a Scottish biodiversity strategy. Now, the biodiversity duty has clearly not worked. I mean, that's 2004 legislation, we're 20 years on, and we're still sitting here talking about the need to set targets to restore nature. The way that the duty is set is as to have regard to the Scottish biodiversity strategy. Now, elsewhere in this bill, in the national park section, there's perhaps a little bit of inspiration that we can take in that the government is amending a duty on public bodies to have regard to national park plans to a stronger duty, which is to facilitate the implementation of national park plans. I think there's a strong logic that if we're doing that on a regional basis for a national park plan, that when we look at both the Scottish biodiversity strategy, but actually the delivery of the nature targets overall, that biodiversity strategy could, the biodiversity duty could be strengthened in a similar way.
Bruce.
Just on the duty and how we're setting the targets, kind of note that the progress is being paired here against the Scottish biodiversity strategy, and I do think it would be better if we pegged that to something a bit more tangible, like the targets, and not the strategy. I mean, the last strategy before we had this one ended in 2020, so we were in a kind of no man's land for a long time. We don't really want that situation with something as important, biodiversity. We've got an act tied to something that can run out and can be changed.
Explicit suggestions there, and I just wonder if anybody who contributed has an example they can point to elsewhere where these things have worked before. No, grand.
I'm just going to suspend the meeting briefly for a technical issue. So just suspend the meeting. Welcome back. I'm going to supplementary from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, I was, as you were talking there, I was thinking about the biodiversity strategy, but also the delivery plans that come out of the biodiversity strategy. And it kind of going back to your point, Ray, around action. And unless action is tied to targets, then, we're not going to meet the targets. So do you think that the whole kind of sort of framework around delivery plans is addressed enough in the bill? Is there an explicit enough link to action in the bill? Or is the assumption that the targets will just drive the delivery plans? I was just curious to know if you had thinking on that.
I mean, I think everyone would have preferred targets, strategy, delivery plans as a more linear approach to this. I think that would have been better, but we are where we are with the way this all came about with us essentially running out of time in the last strategy. So I think it would be worth considering whether there is a strong enough tie here, and do we need something to review the delivery plans once these targets are in place and make sure that they're going in the right direction to achieve the targets laid out in this bill.
Okay.
I'm actually going to jump. I was going to go to a question from Evelyn, but that kind of response takes us into a question about how the targets would be reviewed and monitored. The bill provides for reporting every 3 years and a review of the targets themselves every 10 years. But we're not sure what happens if a target's missed. Any comments on the review and monitoring provisions within the bill? Elise.
I think initially there's probably one of the things that would concern us is that section 2G, subsection 4, there's something on reassigning, ministers being able to reassign the role of ESS as the regulatory body. I mean, I think that's just a line that could potentially undermine the strength of their function in this, and that shouldn't be in the bill. But I think zooming out a bit and looking more broadly to the oversight role of ESS, I think given the kind of dynamic nature of biodiversity, it is important that you can review targets, and in cases if you're moving towards them at pace to increase the ambition, for example, you don't want a completely static system. And I think we have in our Scottish Environment Link response, we've recommended that reviews of the targets are treated as improvement reports under the Continuity Act. So that would trigger statutory response mechanisms once those were tabled in Parliament, which is just another way to kind of bake in some further accountability within kind of on the face of the bill.
So you from your answer, are you saying you don't think ESS is an appropriate body to do the review given their current role as environmental watchdog?
No, I'm saying that I think they are, but there's just one line in the draft bill that says that it gives ministers the ability to reassign that role, but it doesn't kind of explain why. So I think we want ESS fulfilling that function, and we don't want on the face of the bill that could be changed at some point.
Okay. Ria.
Yeah, I think that the bill would be strengthened if there was a more explicit provision that said that ESS could request the Scottish ministers to do a review or to review the targets. So something a bit more proactive on the side of ESS to be able to react to things as they're happening as opposed to waiting for the review periods. Again, linking back to Emma Roddick's question about how there's something similar like that in the Climate Change Scotland Act, that it's not just dependent on the serving government, that there's also the outside bodies that can also influence the procedure.
Yeah, so given the kind of policy direction is to halt biodiversity decline by 2030, we're probably not going to pass the environmental bill until 2026, maybe another year to get our second legislation in place. Is reporting every 3 years appropriate? Should we be looking for, as you say, maybe interim reports or ongoing reports? 3 years when we've got a biodiversity crisis appears too far in the future. Would that be reasonable to suggest? Elise.
Yeah, we actually touched on this in our response to the call for evidence. So support the kind of 3-year outcome progress-focused reports that are on the face of the bill. But I think you're right, we're moving towards 2030 rapidly, and only kind of getting an understanding of progress every 3 years might not be enough. So we've recommended an annual sufficiency review. So that's a review that the Scottish Government would take to essentially assess whether their actions are on track. So it's not looking at changes in species abundance or the actual indicators, but it's looking at the actions that are being taken, so funding and public policy, and reviewing whether in 2 or 3 years' time that is likely to shift the dial, just to know whether the actions today are enough without actually reviewing the outcomes on an annual basis.
Okay. Bruce.
Picking up on your time frame point that you started the question with, I think it's very important when it comes to the secondary legislation. The time frames are tightened up a little bit there. The 12 months, the 12 months that's currently in there needs to be at a maximum, so that we can make sure that we get this bill in with any hope of meeting the 2030 target. And then just also tying into your point, the biodiversity duty as well does need to be tightened up. At the moment, the biodiversity duty, for example, when you are submitting a report as a public body, there's no real requirement to publish those. There's no central place within the NatureScot website, for example, that is published. And I think that would help accountability in general as well.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
The other thing that goes hand in hand with this is that the provisions will only come into force when the Scottish ministers decide at the moment. That's how it's drafted. So there's a real issue about commencement. So I wholly agree with what Bruce is saying about the 12 months. Like, that's really tight in terms of the 2030. So actually, I think an amendment should come forward that should be changed to say that the provisions come into force the day after royal assent is received, because considering the urgency of what needs to be done, it really shouldn't be up to the Scottish ministers to start the stopwatch.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. And the timeframes, I think we've touched on there, but the bill does not dictate the timeframes for targets, either short-term or long-term. What's your views on this? Should the bill include specific timeframes for targets? And if so, what would the appropriate timeframes be? Do you want to come in, Bruce?
I think I mentioned that the sort of not paraphrasing the bill here, but essentially it's tying the targets to delivery of the biodiversity strategy. I think it would be a useful first step to include the 2030 reversal and 2045 nature positive targets in there as a broad starting point. I think that would be a useful thing to do.
Okay. Anybody else?
We're going to go on to look at Part 2, the powers to modify or restate EIA legislation, habitat regulations. And I got a question from Rhoda Grant.
The policy memorandum, if I can say memorandum, sets out the overarching policy intention for taking these delegated powers in Part 2 is to ensure that the legislation remains fit for purpose and could be adapted, if required, to allow effective action in response to the twin climate and biodiversity crises. Do you agree that the power is needed for the EIA legislation and habitats regulation to allow them to remain fit for purpose?
Thank you. Yeah, just to kind of provide some context, RSPB Scotland has a real interest in EIA legislation and the HABS regs, both from a conservation kind of practitioner perspective, but also as those that would make comments on planning applications and also do planning applications on our own reserve. So we're kind of engaging with this legislation from all angles. And together, EIA and HABS regs are essentially the bedrock of environmental protections in Scotland. And it's our view, and it's a very strong one, that these powers are not needed, and that there is, when it comes to the HABS regs, that there is sufficient flexibility within the regulations to adapt to climate change. And that's been rigorously tested in case law, and there was a comprehensive review of the habitats regulations 10 years ago. And that looked specifically at the operation of the habitats regulations in the context of climate change. And the review was clear that they were fit for purpose from a legal perspective, and what was actually holding back important work on the ground, and where some of the kind of frustrations that you might hear coming from practitioners that are kind of working with the HABS regs is to do with a lack of implementation and a lack of clear policy guidance on how they should operate in the context of a changing climate, rather than the legislation itself actually not being fit for purpose.
Brilliantly put. Yep, completely agree with that. And also from the practitioner perspective on reserves and dealing with planning applications, I do think this is much more a guidance issue, and I think we should take the far less costly approach and also adopt the precautionary principle of looking at guidance first and refining the guidance, because even if we did go down the route of amending these regulations, we'd still have to create guidance. So let's do the guidance first, try and clarify what can and can be done, and go down that route. I think it makes sense for lots and lots of reasons, and finally makes sense because it would tie up less of our time creating new legislation when we can be using that for the good of the biodiversity crisis.
Thank you. Dan.
Members are concerned with Part 2 of the bill as it currently stands. I think Ailish and Bruce have just outlined some of the problems that we see with it. Fundamentally, this is an extremely broad enabling power that hands to ministers. This is legislation that could stand in the statute books for decades, and future ministers could use these powers to modify really crucial parts of environmental protection for essentially any purpose that they want. There are the 6 purposes which are outlined in the bill, which any modifications would need to follow, but they are so broadly drafted. I mean, purpose F is to improve or simplify the operation of the law, which is a very subjective judgment, but if a future government thought that improving the operation of the habitats regulations was to radically weaken the effect of them, then they would be able to do so under this, the legislation as it's currently drafted. The policy memorandum does say that these powers are needed because as a result of Brexit, we've lost powers that were previously under the European Communities Act. But I think there's a really important distinction here, is that when we were members of the EU, ministers had the power to, through regulation, to amend these protections, but they could only do so in line with European law. That was a power that existed because if the European directives changed, then the domestic government needed to have a way to implement those changes in domestic law. But there was a backstop there where the powers could never be used to undermine the protections beyond what was in European law. As the bill is currently drafted, there's no such backstop, and there's nothing to prevent future governments from drastically weakening the level of environmental protection that these 2 really important parts of the current legislation have.
Ria, yeah. Sorry.
Just to follow on from what Dan is saying, completely agree with everything he said, so I won't repeat that. But just to say that I would really welcome the committee when the Cabinet Secretary is giving evidence to really scrutinise the policy decision that's been made here. So the policy memorandum really pitches this as a legislative, technical issue, but actually it's a policy decision to have taken these powers as they've been drafted, which are broad and sweeping. And just to give an illustration of an example, the policy memorandum says, oh, we need to do some technical things. So, for example, they give the example that they would like to change some applications to an electronic form. They could have done that in this bill now in a schedule, but they have decided not to. So again, that kind of re-emphasises the point that this has been a policy decision as opposed to really a technical legislative one. And so I would welcome the committee to kind of ask the Cabinet Secretary to marshal the reasons for that.
Thank you. Elise.
Something I think that's really important to consider as well at the beginning of this is that the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee just reported on the use of framework bills and Henry VIII powers, and they concluded that powers that allow flexibility just in case are unlikely to meet the test for the necessity of the power and should be considered inappropriate. And it says repeatedly throughout the policy memorandum and the explanatory notes that, with the exception of the one example surrounding digitising environmental impact assessment, every other use of this power is being framed as something that might be needed just in case in the future, without real tangible examples of using this primary legislation to introduce changes on the front of the bill or, you know, doing it through, I mean, I think even digitising the EIA doesn't require primary legislation and could be done via guidance. So I think it's really important to note that just in case powers have just recently been found to be considered inappropriate, and to really think about that when you're thinking about the nature of kind of just the extent of our environmental protections that these powers could be used to weaken.
Nick, before I bring in, I'm going to move on to the question from Tim Eagle, which will tie it together and maybe help you form a response to that as well. Tim.
Great, thanks. Can I just go back to this point? Because in the policy memorandum, the Scottish Government do set out quite clearly that they feel that there is a massive gap here. Yet last week when we had the academics in, and I think pretty much all of you today are saying, well, no, actually, we think completely differently. So just to go back to your point, Dan, like what is it then that the Scottish Government are trying to suggest they do think they need from the withdrawal of from the European Union that you're now saying isn't required? Just to clarify that point.
So the bill introduces the enabling power that changes to the habitats regulations or the EIA legislation could be introduced through secondary legislation. Now, there is already flexibility built into the habitats regulations. That means that some of the objectives and the policy objectives that they might wish to pursue wouldn't require these new powers, which is an important distinction. There's also there's various powers in various bits of legislation that some of my colleagues are probably better qualified to talk about, where there already is the power to bring forward changes by secondary legislation in particular circumstances. But this, the bill as it's currently drafted, brings in a really overarching and broad and sweeping power, which has very little limitations on it. There's no non-regression clause. Yeah. There's no requirement for changes to be based on scientific advice or even to be consistent with the nature targets which this bill is bringing in. So there is a distinction there between the previous powers which were necessary in the context of being an EU member to implement European directives, which simply aren't required as they're currently drafted in the law.
But my understanding is, I mean, in the policy memorandum, they bring out things like forestry or offshore wind or onshore wind. So whilst there is the ability to change specific things within the habitats regulation, for example, that broader concept of climate change, I mean, I think I agree with you. I'm just playing sort of devil's advocate. Like, is that not what the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, sorry, are trying to do, is actually to give them that power? And I guess if they wanted that, you know, what would that backstop be? Like, how could you secure that? Like, do you remove this in its entirety? Or do you think there could be a risk from doing that? And what would the backstop be if we were to continue with this section?
There's a number of ways you could improve the draft as it stands. Removing it entirely is an option which the committee should consider. One point is that I believe the committee's had previous evidence around about the implementation of habitats regulations and the flexibility which might be needed in the ground to do with climate adaptation or even for nature restoration, which could be things like allowing natural regeneration of woodlands into open ground or the planting of riparian woodlands in protected areas. We strongly believe that these are all possible within the current habitats regulations if the flexibility is used. The Regulation 9D does actually require that ministers must adapt the habitats regulations in line with the UK Site Network's management objectives. There's also the ability to add new designations to the protected features. So there's flexibilities that could be used that don't raise the risk of these protections being fatally undermined.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. I think that's quite... Oh, sorry, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I think on your wider question around, because there's a number of justifications provided around making sure the protected areas network is flexible in the face of climate change, which we think we definitely have powers to do already. And then surrounding making progress towards net zero targets, I think it's important that the committee is aware that the Scottish Government does have power to alter the HABS regs, both through the Energy Act for offshore wind, and currently the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is introducing changes to electricity environmental impact assessment to allow onshore wind to facilitate that more in Scotland. So if it's about making progress and expanding renewables capacity, that is dealt with in other pieces of legislation. And I think it's also important to think that Scotland has an amazing capacity for renewable energy, and that has been expanded, you know, rapidly in the last 20 or 30 years within the current regulatory environment. That's with the habitats regulations in place. So it's not that environmental impact assessment or the habitats regulation is mutually exclusive when it comes to renewable energy generation. It's just that it helps to steer it towards the right places, and we can have both. And Scotland is demonstrating that we do currently have both, and we just don't feel that the justifications stack up at all.
Okay. Yeah, completely agree. I'd just add that, as well as 9D, the Regulation 11 also gives further clarification that we can delist sites as well. Not that we particularly want to see sites delisted, but the power does exist there. Yeah.
Okay.
Callum.
Just to echo all the concerns that were raised, Marine Conservation Society as well are incredibly concerned about the rationale for these proposals, and would support everything that's been said in relation to them. And just to highlight, they're the backbone of the MPA network as well. There's 58 SACs with a marine component. There's a number of marine bird SBAs as well, and the regulations have ensured that they've played a leading role in demonstrating how the network should be adequately protected. There was successful activism in the early 2000s to secure protection for the Firth of Lorne, which I'd like to acknowledge, and that's as a result of having those regulations. So we'd be very concerned about them being watered down in this way. And very quickly, in relation to the marine space, other EU nations are using the regulations and allowing other features to be added to marine SAC, such as native oysters. They're already applied in a flexible way, and there's examples of it being applied in a flexible way without having to amend the legislation.
I've got a brief supplementary on that from Beatrice, and I can come back to Tim.
Yeah, just a very brief on Callum's point. Do you think that could undermine the MPAs if there was any change?
For all the reasons that Dan and others have set out, we'd be extremely concerned about how those powers might be used in future parliamentary sessions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Actually, I think that's really interesting, because I think this came up quite significantly, as I said, last week as well. And I guess it's just, I want to be really clear in my mind that by not allowing powers, you're not restricting what we need to do in terms of biodiversity, climate change, etc., because I don't think any of us would want to see that. So I was going to, my main question was actually going to be on the powers, sorry, not the powers, the purposes for which this could be changed. But just to absolutely clarity, all of you would agree that actually it's not about the purposes they set out in the policy memorandum. This is just about fundamentally this power should just simply not be there. Does that make sense? Because they set out, I think, Dan, you mentioned the various purposes that they set out in the policy memorandum to ensure consistency or compatibility with other legal regimes, to take account of changes in technology, etc., etc. But you wouldn't add to them or amend those.
We've not been convinced in the first instance by the government of the need for these powers. We could go through line by line the purposes. I mean, 3A1, to maintain and advance standards in relation to restoring, enhancing and managing the natural environment. I mean, I would not be concerned about that being in legislation, but it's the power overall as it's introduced, without non-aggression clause, without the levels of scrutiny which we would have expected to see in it, and with such a broad scope. I mean, one area in particular which we would be concerned about is the 3B, which is the target to facilitate progress towards any statutory target relating to the environment, but it says particularly the net zero emissions target set by the Climate Change Act. Now, of course, we're concerned about meeting the net zero targets, but I think it's really important as a point of principle that when we're bringing forward a bit of legislation which is designed to protect the natural environment, that we don't unintentionally play off nature against climate, when actually we know that meeting net zero can and should be done in conjunction with restoring nature. So a power that would potentially allow nature protections to be significantly weakened in order to meet net zero, I think would be drafting that we would have particular concern over.
Okay.
I would just say yes. I don't think that part 2 is needed. I think for ensuring that the protected areas network is flexible in the face of climate change, we have Regulation 9D. In making progress towards net zero, that's dealt with in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill and the Energy Act. and to restore the powers that were lost after Brexit, even though there was a non-regression clause there. The Scottish Government is committed to keeping pace, and we do have the Continuity Act right up until 2031 if it's extended. So we've looked at this in great detail, as you'd imagine, and we cannot find any justification in existing regulations or other pieces of legislation that point to the need for these powers, never mind them being as broad and sweeping as they are, given the list of purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just to reiterate again that this is a policy choice, not a technical choice. So as Elise just said, they have the powers in the Withdrawal Act until 2031. So if it was a technical thing, this would have been drafted very differently. And again, to reiterate what Dan said, it goes back to the point I said earlier that climate change targets shouldn't be in competition with biodiversity targets, and these sweeping powers could have the unintended consequences that a future serving government would just do that. And again, I think the Cabinet Secretary, when they come to give evidence, they need to marshal their argument about why they need this power. So the easiest thing to do is put in an amendment that just says leave out. But then there's so much more in it that could be questioned. So, for example, most of it is the only thing that is left to affirmative procedure is if there's an offence created. So that basically means, so as we were saying in Section 3F, anything to improve or simplify the operation of the law could either be negative or affirmative based on a future Scottish minister's decision. So again, it's that thing of like, you need to allow flexibility in secondary legislation, but then there's also, it's an increasingly an act of faith and a significant blow to scrutiny. So that's the first thing. It's like, the way it's been drafted has been policy choices. You know, there's not baked in non-regression. Most of it is left to negative and not affirmative. And it could have unintended consequences of competing targets, which really shouldn't be the case.
Cool. Thank you. I know slightly repeating ourselves there, but I just think it's an important point, because you could go line by line through the various things, but actually that's maybe not the point we should be focusing on. Actually, there's a bigger point here, but thank you.
Yeah, one of my points last week was that we've in practice we've seen the likes of the Kendoon-Tungland power upgrade, which went through scenic areas and wherever, went to the reporter. The reporter recommended that the planning application was turned down because of the unacceptable impact on the environment, for the Scottish Government then to ignore the views of the reporter. So they, because they thought that the impact was acceptable in relation to securing power security or energy security. So it would suggest that the government already got powers to ignore, if you like, or dismiss some concerns when it comes to protecting the environment. Elise.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate that point, the HABS regs are amazing at protecting the most important places and species that we have in Scotland, but they have the IROPI imperative reasons of overriding public interest clause that says that if you need to do something which will negatively impact upon a designated site, if that's for reasons of human health or if you need to construct a road to enable hospital access, you know, of course there are exceptions baked into that. So if the Scottish Government can demonstrate that it needs to do something in a certain area for the public good and for public benefit, then that flexibility exists and has been used within regulation to allow access to hospitals or some cases for renewable energy projects. So you can, there is flexibility in there for lots of reasons.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, I think Tim's covered perhaps a lot of the kind of questions and kind of points in this section, but if I could maybe just kind of go back to one of the specific purposes, which was about ensuring consistency or compatibility with other legal regimes. I just wondered, I was interested in your reflections on that, particularly what's happening in the rest of the UK at the moment, the direction of the Habitats directives there, potential kind of weakening to allow economic growth in some areas. And just again, Ailis, you kind of touched on the relationship there with the Electricity Act powers. I'm interested to know whether you think there's a particular concern there with a divergence of regimes between what's there under Section 36, Section 37 powers, which is well understood by industry, I think, the requirements of EIA, HABS regs, and everything else, and what we have at the moment for other development that's protected by HABS regs and EIA procedures. So, yeah, Yeah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's one of the purposes that we'd kind of take most concern with in ensuring consistency and compatibility, either with domestic or international legal regimes. But that's regardless of whether or not that's a strengthening or a weakening of those regimes. So I think, you know, that we have the commitment to keep pace, and we should therefore be able to improve HABS regs and EIA if that should be appropriate. But with, exactly like you said, what we're seeing down south with, you know, changes to HABS regs and planning, that would just, we don't want the Scottish Government to put something on the face of this bill that would allow our most important protections to be dragged down by progress stalling in other places, rather than pulled up to kind of work towards best practice where we can, which is what we should be looking to do in maintaining or advancing standards.
So can you spell out what that other legal regime, what is the concern with that other legal regime in other parts of the UK?
Well, I mean, it could be anything, really. Okay. It could be any legal regime here or abroad we could look to align with. But, you know, there could be a number of examples of anything that could be done to EIAs or to the HABS regs, which we know are often perceived to be blockers to development, even though it's our strong view that they steer development to the right places and that the IROPI clause allows development when there is a good enough reason. So there's a number of examples. I mean, that's kind of the issue with the purposes, is that they are so broad and that it could be any reason without, you know, cause for non-regression. You can make any sort of restatement or amendment to the HABS regs or to EIA.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Bruce?
Just to simply add, and of course that's not just this government we're talking about, it's any government at any point in the future. And you know, if the government changed down south as well, would we a race to the bottom with them as well? That's the real thing we're concerned about.
Okay, but I'm interested to understand what a race to the bottom might look like practically. Where do you actually see potential erosion in protections for the environment with other regimes? Right. Well, I think we've seen a lot of comment from down south recently about it's newts versus development, and there's obviously a strong lobby for getting rid of some of those protections. We don't want to be in a situation where we're playing those two things off. It's kind of like climate, net zero and nature positive. But those things, we can't play them off against each other. If we want a sustainable future, we're going to have to make those things work together. So there could be, as Zila says, any number of impacts on EIA or habitat regs that would have negative environmental outcomes. Would that also include the regulations in relation to European protected species, and not just sites and habitats, but also thinking about marine environment? You know, disturbance of EPS protected species. I'm just trying to understand what the threat is from, you know, a particular alignment with other legal regimes. What's underneath that?
I'm trying to come in. I could come in after you.
Yeah, well, I was going to give an example of in England at the minute. They're looking at the sort of compensation measures that could be put in place to compensate for any damage to nature from rolling out offshore wind. And then, and as part of that, they're looking at potentially de-designating bits of sites or finding other sites. So it's that sort of thing that is a concern. And I think that goes back to the point that I was making about the SACs being the sort of the internationally important spine or bedrock of the MPA network. You know, we wouldn't want to see anything that puts those at risk. I mean, and that may not be the policy intent at all at the amendments, but, you know, there's nothing stopping, as we've said multiple times, you know, future governments with those powers being able to, you know, the concern is potentially weaken those. So that's the big concern for us.
Yeah, I think, like we're saying, because the powers are so broad and sweeping, and that we would be held, you know, hostage to fortune of a future-serving government. You know, so for example, if you take the National Marine Plan at the moment, which is meant to set out planning at sea, and should really take a holistic approach in the spirit of the Marine Scotland Act 2010. You know, the powers under here, as we've mentioned already, you know, Section 3, paragraph F about any operation of the law, you know, someone could come in and say, well, we really need to meet our climate change targets, so we need to, undesignate this, or need to push this out of the way, or, completely bypass whole sectors, right, where actually they all need to be working together. So the National Marine Plan at the moment should have sectorial targets in order to bring in, hear from everyone in there. So, not only offshore wind and fisheries and marine protected areas, but coastal communities. And so the concern with something like this, and as we were saying about regression, is that a future serving government could come in and just decide we're going to sweep all away that, and it's all about, all about this industry or all about that industry because we have to meet this target. So I guess it's an extreme example, but I guess that's what you were asking for, isn't it? That, how far could this be pushed?
Just very quickly on that point, I mean, again, that highlights what's sorely lacking in the marine space, which is that proper spatial management framework to be able to assess cumulative impacts, to be able to prioritise effective use and appropriate use for different elements of different parts of the marine environment, different seabed types and so on. That's something that we're calling for right across the UK. So you need to have a proper ecosystem-based framework that actually starts from the premise of what does the space look like, what is appropriate use for each of the types of seabed. The bedrock of protection is the network, but then what other measures are required beyond that as well.
Okay. Elena.
The question I had was actually, the first part of it was round about your views on the fact that the Scottish Government has taken the decision not to include a non-regression clause within Part 2, but I think we've already heard quite clearly your views in that space. Are there alternative approaches to framing these powers that you would have liked to have seen in the bill? So if we think about things like protecting certain aspects or core aims of the regimes, or requiring additional consultation, scientific input, or indeed parliamentary scrutiny of certain changes that could arise. So in the absence of there being a non-regression clause contained within it, are there other ways that there could be a way to actually look at the powers in the round and start to curtail perhaps where it could go? Or you could just come back and tell me about your views on the absence of a non-regression clause.
I think I'd start, as we're all aware in this room by now probably, that, putting aside the fact that we don't think Part 2 of the bill is justified, if it has to pass, then there are a number of strengthenings of it that would be essential. So at the very start, the powers are to modify or restate EIA and HABS regs, so we'd want to change that to amend. We'd want to ideally have a non-regression clause, but if that couldn't be there, then there'd need to at least be public explanation and justification of the use of powers before they're ever employed. And then a kind of requirement that the Scottish Government would have to seek independent expert advice, so either from NatureScot or Environmental Standards Scotland, before using the powers, and definitely that all regulations would be subject to the affirmative or super affirmative procedure rather than negative. And public consultation as well would also be something we'd welcome. And I think, even if non-regression, it's clear in the policy memorandum that the Scottish Government hasn't included that because they feel it would limit the flexibility of these powers too much, which again comes back to the kind of just-in-case side of things that we take issue with. But the first clause, which is one of the purposes for use of the powers, is actually to maintain or advance standards in relation to the environment. So that could be, if that had primacy and you had to achieve that before also improving or simplifying the operation of the law, would be a means of kind of including non-regression without calling it as such. But we've got this all in our response to the call for evidence. But if Part 2 has to pass, which we wouldn't like it to, but if that has to happen, then there are a number of really essential safeguards that must be baked into the legislation on the face of the bill.
Ria.
Yeah, I would absolutely concur with everything Elise has just said, and actually just go a step further, that in Section 3, that you could bring forward an amendment that basically said that paragraphs B to F can only be done in pursuit of A. So A is the primary, and everything after that has to be done in pursuit of that. So that's, again, a kind of strengthening of intention of how you can use these powers.
I agree fully with Eilish's summary of the ways in which that part of the bill could be improved, but I just wanted to highlight, in addition to that, that the SPICE briefing on the bill actually has very useful analysis of the other bits of legislation which already give ministers some of these powers in particular circumstances, and it just highlights the fact that in these cases there are environmental safeguards built into those bits of legislation. So the bill as it's drafted is a sort of standout against the other bits of legislation in the absence of having those environmental safeguards. So it would appear to me that to save us an awful lot of work and grief and concern, we should just dump Part 2 altogether. Does anybody disagree with that? Well, I like to keep things simple. On that note, we're about to move on to Part 3 on national parks, but I suggest we have a brief suspension for a comfort break for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. We're now going to look at some questions on Part 3 of the bill on national parks, and we'll kick off with Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you all. This question, I suppose, Nicky Sinclair, will maybe come to you first with this one. But the National Park, the Part 3 of the legislation proposes to broaden the purposes of national parks to include stronger emphasis on supporting biodiversity and nature recovery and addressing the climate crisis. And I know Dan mentioned earlier about biodiversity targets in relation to national park strategies. So my question is, what are your views on the changes to the statutory purposes for national parks in the bill, and do you think that it will have a practical impact on how we implement these changes?
Thank you. I think the proposed changes to the aims, the 4 aims of the national parks, are really modernising, and they're fairly modest, but they perhaps reflect 20 years of experience and what the parks are now focusing on. The addition of the list, which gives additional detail, there's a new subsection, and that includes biodiversity and climate, amongst other things. So it's good to see that on the face of the bill. I think it focuses minds that that is what the parks are about, and it's a large, a main focus for them. And I think possibly the aims are quite broad already, so you could argue that biodiversity and climate are within scope already, but it's good to see that highlighted. I think probably the change to the duty on public bodies to have regard to the aims might be the most important change in that section.
And you mentioned about modest changes, because some of the language when we were at Cairngorms on Sunday and Monday, it talks about the language such as, instead of sustainable use of natural resources, it says sustainable management and use of natural resources. So what impact does adding that one word have?
I think it probably better reflects sort of natural capital approaches to land management and thinking about biodiversity and climate in those terms, rather than just sustainable use of resources, which, I don't know, you could think about extraction of minerals or what have you in that.
We also heard about, instead of the language of restoration, because it was restoring to what? Restoring to pre-Victorian times, restoring to 200 years ago, 300, whatever. But also the language of enhancement was maybe more objective rather than restoring. Any thoughts around the language that maybe could be altered?
So this is A in the list of restoring and regenerating biodiversity in the area. I take your point about restoring to what, but you perhaps could be minded to think of that as restoring to good health or good ecosystem health. I don't think enhancing might also be open to interpretation, but it is used in MPF4, for instance, to do with biodiversity, so that might be equally good, yeah.
Okay. I'm happy if anybody else wants to come in before I do bylaws.
I would say that, again, Wildlife Conservation Trust are broadly supportive of the progress to clarify the aims of national parks. But we're also concerned here and elsewhere within the bill as currently drafted that there's a risk of placing increasing obligation on landowners and public bodies, people who be delivering for biodiversity, without providing anywhere the adequate support, resource or clear routes for implementation. And I think that we're concerned that this will create a culture of compliance rather than one of ecological improvement. And it would be really great if we could see within this bill a mechanism to allow us to build on collaboration and support for land managers to allow them to meet those biodiversity targets, and in particular through clustering. And I think this, within national parks, provides an opportunity for us to do that, to deliver a landscape-scale delivery for biodiversity. And through this type of clustering approach, which we know from our experience in the South works incredibly well for delivering tangible biodiversity benefits. So yes, broadly supportive of the aims of the bill in terms of national park, but there are opportunities there that I think we need to capitalise on.
Just, I guess, turning it on its head slightly, what is wrong with the aims of the national parks as they stand that they need amended by this bill? What is being prevented? I remember they were hard fought at the time and seemed to have kind of created the right balance, and if it ain't broke, why fix it?
So I come in. I think perhaps there isn't anything particularly wrong with the legislation in terms of the aims, but they are 20 years old. We are in a different place now with climate and biodiversity and the urgency of those threats. So I think it's helpful to see those words in the legislation. Otherwise, I think it's a sort of modernisation of the words rather than a major changes.
Can I ask, there was A, B, C and D in the aims. Was there any hierarchy in those? So was it priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, etc.? And does that roll on to the updates in the new bill as it's drafted?
So the National Park Authority's main job is to collectively achieve the aims of the national parks together. So it's only if there's a conflict or perceived conflict between the 4 aims that Section 9(6) of the 2000 Act comes into play. That's the Sanford Principle, the National Park Principle it's sometimes called, which means the National Park Authority has to give more weight to the first conservation aim, the natural and cultural heritage aim. So that only comes into play when there's a conflict between them.
Okay, so we've also got a list now. Now, I don't particularly like lists because they often suggest that there's something missed out. And to start a list with stating without limit to the generality of the above aims, those aims include. So it doesn't exclude anything, but the very fact that there is A to F, and that's a list, is there a risk that then becomes far more stringent when it comes to looking at investment or development within the park? And again, I suppose my question is, are they in order of priority? So it may be that an objective to promote sustainable development might be overtaken by the need to restore and regenerate biodiversity in the area. Is it your understanding that they're also in order of priority?
No, I don't see any order of priority implied. The only priority, I think, is in Section 9.6.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there any benefit in having that list on the face of the bill? Surely that could just be part of the guidance.
I think it perhaps to the wider world gives the understanding of the breadth of what national parks are doing, and so it's extra information. You could probably argue that they could do everything that's included in that list already, but it's perhaps clearer to have it there.
Okay. You stated that we've now got 20 years' experience and this is updating. Surely at some point over that 20 years we should have an independent review of actually how the national parks are performing, because currently we have annual reports, but they're produced by the National Park Board. So we've heard the argument that it's, in effect, the marking your own homework. Given it's 20 years now and we're looking to make amendments which are supposed to improve the function of national parks, is it not time to have an independent review to actually see and give confidence that national parks national parks are actually delivering on what their aims are?
Well, I mean, obviously we need to keep things under review, but there is obviously an urgency about climate and biodiversity particularly, and you know, there's a concern that if we had a review and then legislated, it might be a decade before the legislation was changed, perhaps. I mean, there was a review which reported in 1991 on national parks in the UK at the time. It was the Edwards panel report called Fit for the Future, and it recommended that there should be a duty on public bodies to further the purposes or the aims of national parks. That purpose only came into be, that duty rather, it only came into play in England in 2023. So that's a long time, and I think we need to get on with making public bodies and national parks more effective now rather than wait for another decade.
But without evidence on what could make the most effective, an independent review, how do we know that this is right? So we've just finished on part 1 and part 2, and a lot of the discussion was around review, reporting, targets. But national parks appear not to have to do that on an independent basis. Again, it's marking your own homework. And, you know, we've currently got another area in Scotland potentially being designated a national park. And one of the big issues we see there is a lack of confidence that national parks actually are delivering. But if there had been an independent review undertaken at some point, those benefits, or otherwise, would be quite clear and transparent.
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot of public consultation about the national parks activities and the legislation over the last 3-4 years. So I think there's been 3 separate consultations that have looked at aspects of their operation. I mean, I appreciate that's not the same as a review, but some things have come out very clearly in that the public clearly wants parks to do more for biodiversity. That came out very strongly in the last consultation responses. So, yes, keep things under review. I'm perfectly happy with that. We wouldn't be against that, but there is a need to move things on and try and improve things now rather than in a decade's time.
Okay, Emma.
Okay, thanks. That's useful to hear that. I know there's been calls for the review, independent review, especially if we're going to establish a new national park, for instance, in Galloway. My other thoughts are around in tackling the climate emergency or promoting biodiversity or the nature emergency. The Lomond and Trossachs already have the powers to do fixed penalty notices, and the bill introduces new powers for Scottish ministers to be able to set out in regulations how fixed penalty notices could be used for enforcing national park bylaws. So I'm interested in how do you feel, or how do you think that the power to introduce regulations and related to fixed penalty notices will be effective in supporting national parks and tackling nature and climate emergency? And just looking at it's the potential to deal with wildfires, as we've seen. So that would be one example of how bylaws could help support tackling wildfires, which again is about how do we help support nature.
I think it's understandable that the parks are looking at bylaws for wildfires. I know the Cairngorms has put a bylaw before ministers, I think, at the moment. And the current process for enforcing bylaws does seem quite slow and arduous, onerous on them and both the court system. So the backstop of enforcing that way is quite difficult for them to do. So I can see that introducing fixed penalty notices makes it a more active enforcement and perhaps more real to people on the ground as well. So it seems a practical, probably more proportionate response to dealing with those issues. I imagine it's still quite a difficult thing for people on the ground who are actually doing that job. And I think our one concern about it is that it might slightly change the perception of rangers, that they're more of an enforcement service than an education service. And if it's easier to enforce a bylaw, does that mean there's a sort of shift in culture to enforcement first rather than engage, educate and encourage before you get to the backstop of enforcement? So it would be good to know, good to have it confirmed that it really is the backstop position rather than a shift in culture. But I think it will. I think the public probably understands a fixed penalty notice and the implications of that probably more clearly than the alternative that we have now. So it may well help.
Right. Just a final question. That we talk about carrot and stick kind of language, and education is obviously one of the first things that the Rangers would be doing. So you'd be in favour of continuing that approach, and the backstop would be issuing a fixed penalty notice, for instance?
Absolutely. If education and provision of alternatives, facilities for fires in certain places, or controlled ways, or then that may remove some of the issues. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Nick, would you like to come in?
Thanks. Just to say that we are wholly supportive of that idea and of the introduction of fixed penalty notices elsewhere in national parks, learning from the lessons of Loch Lomond and Trossachs, but provided that was coupled with that education and partnership, which is absolutely crucial.
Okay. Mark, have you got a supplementary?
Yeah, it was to go back to the issue of the central purpose of national parks. I mean, you've now got this expanded list. You've got the Sanford Principle as conflict. You can prioritise nature, but what would be your thoughts, which I think the government did consult on, of just making nature, the central overriding purpose? I mean, the designation is based on nature and the environment. So, what would be your thoughts on that?
The designation is based on natural and cultural heritage, so I think there might be a bit of a concern if that was lost completely in terms of natural and cultural heritage contributes to, say, landscape quality. But I think it's certainly public support for the parks doing much more on biodiversity, and that was reflected in the consultation responses. From memory, the government consulted on quite a raft of changes, introducing biodiversity and climate to the overall purpose of national parks. And then they changed the aims as well. And then I think there was a change in the wording from natural heritage to natural assets in the aims. And it wasn't entirely clear to us what the outcome of all those changes together would be, which I think was a bit of concern.
Right, but on that proposed change about making the purpose focused on nature and climate, what was your view on that?
Well, I think there's nothing to stop parks doing a lot on climate and nature already, and the breadth of the aims does allow them to be, if you like, an exemplar in how you do that, still involving people who live there, who visit. There's the recreational aspect, the access aspect to national parks as well, which has always been really important. So it would be quite a big shift to focus solely on biodiversity, but I think the parks as they stand at the moment have an amazing role in terms of mainstreaming biodiversity, which some of the colleagues have talked about today, and showing how it can be restored or enhanced or whatever, while it's still a working landscape.
Just for capacity constraint reasons with parts 1 and 2 of the bill, we've not had a lot of time, unfortunately, to focus on this national park section of the bill, but in general, the kind of ecosystems approach that we would like to see across all land use is one that we think would work in a national park situation to be an exemplar of how that's best used. So, of course, the Scottish Wildlife Trust want to see nature and biodiversity and climate prioritised, but we're very aware of that having to be led, a place-based approach led by local people. So I think that is quite important with even how the bill, with how national parks are described. And I think having the only focus on climate and nature might disengage from the outset significant numbers of stakeholders.
I beg your pardon, Dan was going to come in the previous comment. Sorry, and I'll bring you in, Nick.
Just to add briefly, I think, Mark, you've hit on a good point about the fact that the proposed redrafting of the aims really has its roots in the government's original proposal to bring in that overarching purpose for national parks. As Bruce said, as a sector, obviously we want to see national parks and other public bodies prioritise nature and climate. It's not entirely obvious how that overarching purpose would have differed from, in practice, from the Sanford principle, but I do welcome, and I understand the convener's hesitation about just adding lists of everything, but I do welcome the fact that the list adds in biodiversity and climate as aims, which I think could help with the interpretation of the first aim when it comes to the application of the Sanford principle.
Thank you. Nick?
And it was really just to back up the points that both made by Dan and Bruce, in that if the focus is on nature and climate solely, then we risk disincentivising those other practical land uses within the national parks which are actually delivering for biodiversity and climate, even though that might not be their primary objective.
Yeah. Nikki?
A point on the Sanford principle that we wondered whether the committee might consider whether it should also apply to any other public bodies, Scottish ministers and others, who the duty to have regard to the aims, although perhaps that could also be strengthened to a more active duty, but whether the Sanford duty should apply to that. It may not come into play very often, but it might matter sometimes.
So do you mean in relation to a local authority that was covering the same area as a national park, should also have to apply that Sanford principle? Or?
Only in respect to activities that affect the park,
okay,
particularly, yeah.
Okay. I think that leads us into the next question from Tim Eagle.
Is there any prior examples of the Sanford principle being put into place? Yeah.
So there's a similar principle exists in English national parks too. Yeah.
But just because obviously I go back to that point that Bruce, I think Nick was making a minute ago, and that was my worry, and the convener did pick up on that as well. That kind of it's F, isn't it? You know, because it's not prioritised, that list, but F is where it talks about kind of the local community and the economic development of national parks. And yet, one of the early criticisms of when this first came out was, but surely a national park is best, at its best, when you recognise the people that are within it, the people live and work within it. And actually, when people see a list, they kind of do in their head automatically think, oh, well, we're down here at the bottom. All of this stuff is more important. I mean, are you concerned by that at all? And I guess when you mentioned the Sanford principle, because I maybe don't know it well enough, but this is where the conservation will always take priority over public enjoyment of the park, isn't it?
Only if there's a conflict, yeah.
Yeah, where a conflict exists, yeah.
Well, your point on people only appearing in F, they are also one of the main four aims of national
in
parks
the first four.
Too. Yeah, I mean, admittedly, it's number 4 again mostly, but you know, they're not ranked apart from the Sanford one at all. Yeah.
But if they're not ranked, it maybe wouldn't matter if we moved them around a bit.
I I don't think anyone would object to shuffling them around.
Very good. I think just that point is because that was something that was picked up initially by a lot of local people, and I guess it's if you are going to drive forward your climate and biodiversity, you've got to do that. I would have thought you had to do that with local people in mind. Yeah. But what I was actually going to ask is the bill upgrades the duty on relevant public bodies from have regard to facilitate the implementation of. Now, I'm a former councillor. Councils have huge. I mean, there's other public bodies, but councils like Murray Council within the Cairngorm National Park or Aberdeenshire Council would fall within this, and huge responsibilities, massive lacks of funding, not a lot of staff resource to put into things like this. How do you see that working? What's your sort of initial feeling around what does that change really mean in practice?
So that upgrade is the duty from have regard to the park plans to facilitate implementation of the park plans. So I think that's seen as a more active duty, that perhaps there'll be more engagement with developing the park plans, that it might not, you know, there's already a lot of collaboration over that, but hopefully it will focus minds a bit more and help the whole thing to become slightly more effective.
Okay, but what was not there previously then? Because you're right, councils would have been part of, I mean, any council or any local person could have fed into a national park plan before through consultation. So, but why is the change necessary then?
So I think have regard to is considered quite a weak duty.
Fair enough.
That it's quite hard to hold anybody to account unless they actually say they haven't had regard to something. That, you know, they say, well, we have regard to it, but we ignored it. So a duty to facilitate implementation implies that you are actually going to take the park plan seriously, and if you've committed or agreed during the consultation process that something's going in the park plan, then you'll at least do your best to see that happens.
Do you see, though, how that could be quite scary for some public bodies? Because what does that mean in practice? In terms of potentially the financial, is there a financial contribution to that? Is there a time commitment to that? And actually, how do you compete? How do you do that with competing priorities that might be in that area as well?
I do see that it's a shift in thinking, but if we are serious about making national parks more effective, then it does seem to be a useful tool to shift from have regard to something more powerful, so that the park plans, which have been agreed through a consultative, collaborative process, they're not going to just be plonked on the public body's desk, like, here you go, this is what you've got to do, sorry we didn't consult you. There'll have been involvement through all of that.
Dan?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that as a former councillor you sort of defaulted to thinking about how that would impact local authorities, which are obviously a significant public body and who might face particular resource challenges if there was expectations of really significant actions that came with that. My first thought when I read that change to the duty was more based on national agencies, NatureScot, Forestry and Land Scotland, Scottish Forestry. Ultimately, national parks are designations because they are deemed to be of national importance, and I think it's an important principle that the public sector overall are delivering against those national objectives, and that's exactly what we were discussing when we talked in the first part of this session, when we talked about mainstreaming biodiversity progress across the public sector.
Okay, I mean, I think. Yeah, my head initially went to councils, whereas you're probably right, there's then broader organisations as well. But it's just, I could imagine local authorities being particular. Sorry, Nikki, did you want to come back in?
Well, it was just following up from what Dan was saying, that other examples might be deer management and how NatureScot aligns its work with national parks, or Transport Scotland and considering road building, or woodland grants, whether that's for natural regeneration, which is the park's preferred method of woodland expansion, or where fences go with respect to endangered species. It would cover a whole load of things, not just councils.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, fine.
Just before we move away from national parks, I suppose I want to touch on what's not in there with regards to national parks. So everybody will be aware, no doubt, about the controversy over the designation of, or the potential designation of Galloway. But the concerning thing is how they actually arrived at Galloway being the sole contender for that designation, and the lack of transparency or understanding of actually how we got there, because there's nothing in the legislation that sets out the route to being identified as a candidate for a national park. Now, I don't think there's any doubt, whatever side of the argument you're on, whether you're pro-national parks or anti-national parks, the process has been a car crash and caused a lot of division, a lot of incredibly polarised views, and ultimately the process has totally derailed what should have been a very positive experience, similar to the positive experience that was experienced 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when the first designations took part. And we heard the weekend from stakeholders that there was 300-400 businesses very actively got involved with the setting up the Cairngorms National Park, and how businesses and individuals and communities would play a massive part in that. Whereas with the Galloway National Park, that has been completely absent, I would say. There has not been that clear indication of what a national park would be. Should there be something in legislation to make it clearer, and the obligations of the government to ensure that the process to designate new national parks is more engaging, got more information? Because one of the problems is there's a massive vacuum of how the new national park might look. We're always told that Galloway, being an area of intensive forestry and intensive farming, intensive renewables, unlike any other national park in the world, how it can be different. We're told it's going to be different, but not in what way. So should the legislation around national parks have contained more direction of future policy in designating parks, given the mess that the current process is in?
I think the 2000 Act does set out the requirements for designation quite clearly. The government obviously chose a different process in the lead up to the designation with the nominations process. That was the way that was done was also publicly consulted on and laid out, and the nominations process seemed to be carried out according to what the process that had been developed, if you like. And I think 2 other areas of Scotland were considered to have met through the nominations process the requirements probably to be a national park too. So even Galloway was one of the possibilities. The Minister chose to take that one forward. That non-statutory process doesn't have to be repeated by a future government who's wanting more national parks. It could be varied. Whether setting out a process that appears to be, would be appropriate now would stand the test of time in future, I don't know.
Okay. Any other comments? No? Okay, we'll move on to our final question from Evelyn Tweed.
To last. Are there other areas that you would like to have seen in the bill that we have not already covered?
Ria.
One thing we would like to suggest is the Scottish Sentencing Council in their latest strategy have indicated that they're going to look at wildlife sentencing, and they're going to report on this. So we obviously don't want to prejudge that report, and we really hope that the report maybe aligns with when stage 2 amendments are open. But we would really like them to consider how marine sentencing is done, and whether at the moment the penalties are quite low, and whether that's creating an effective deterrent, and whether the level of sanction is proportionate to the harm caused. So again, we don't want to prejudge what the Scottish Sentencing Council is doing, but we would love it if it could align that, if it came out that, yes, actually, it isn't enough of a deterrent, the fixed penalty notices are too low, especially in relation to England, that there would be enough time to put in amendments for that. And then just to reiterate that, you know, at the moment, marine is not explicit in the Act. I think it's kind of implicit, but not explicit. But Scotland, you know, has a significant responsibility and a leadership role to play, since it holds 60% of the UK seas and 13% of Europe's marine area. So again, we would just welcome more explicit amendments to the marine, especially if this legislation is going to deliver any support for our marine ecosystems.
Callum?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely support that point. As I was making at the top, it should be clear that it applies to the extent of the exclusive economic zone. I touched on suggestions. We'd like to see amendment to Section 5 in relation to National Park Marine Plan, of the Marine Scotland Act. So the National Marine Plan is required to deliver nature recovery targets. We often talk about the three-pillared approach to nature conservation: site, species and wider seas measures, which the Marine Scotland Act was drafted very much in mind, which recognises that nature delivery for nature is across not just the MPA network and other sites, but also wider species measures and wider seas measures such as marine planning and fisheries management. So we've just made some suggestions in the written evidence that could help in law further tighten up those connections. So Section 68(7) of the Marine Scotland Act could include climate adaptation. It's currently saying climate mitigation. This is the section about what's to have regard to when setting up MPA networks. Section 68(9). The purposes of MPAs could also help to protect essential fish habitats and juvenile congregation areas. There's often quite a siloed approach between fisheries management and MPAs. It would be great if the law could actually reflect the benefits that designations can provide for fisheries management and improving fisheries management. So that's one suggestion there. Section 68 could be amended to introduce a duty to support ecosystem recovery and the development of the site network. Just a couple more here. Introduce the duty in there as well to review MPA site selection guidance and publish updated guidance by specified date. And then the Inshore Fisheries Act, we've written to suggest that could be amended Section 2A(3) of the Act to add to marine environmental purposes mitigation and adaptation to climate change and supporting ecosystem recovery. So tweaks the Marine Act and the Fisheries Act to help emphasise the fisheries benefits of protecting nature and to emphasise the role that improved fisheries management can make in relation to contributing to ecosystem recovery and adapting and mitigating climate change.
I'm just going to go around the table because I'm quite sure you'll all have something to say on this. Nick?
Would have been made already today, and that I think we would like to see them more focus on collaborative landscape scale approaches to delivering biodiversity, and that is not explicitly delivered in the bill. It may come through secondary legislation, but that would be our point.
Okay, thank you. Dan?
There's a number of areas which we've suggested in our evidence. I'll go through them very briefly, but as well as the marine points that Callum's covered, we think that the legislative basis for the land use strategy could be updated to include the nature recovery targets as part of the land use strategy's required objectives, as well as we think that ecological connectivity through nature networks should be included as part of the land use strategy. On nature networks more broadly, we are calling for a duty on ministers to report progress on nature networks on a regular basis. And we think that this is a good opportunity in this bill to introduce the powers to ban the use of peat in horticulture, which is a long-standing commitment, which we've got no other legislative basis, legislative opportunity to take forward. And finally, there's a number of areas related to invasive non-native species, which we've suggested in written evidence, which are obviously a significant driver of biodiversity loss. Finally, we have suggested as well that the government undertake a review of community participation in decision making. I think the community aspect has come up a number of times today. I think it is inseparable from the achievement of nature recovery targets, and we want to make sure that communities of interest and communities of place have the most effective way to input into policy making across nature recovery.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a bit of part 3, which is to do with access rights and sort of tidying up of the Land Reform Act 2003. We think it might be useful to include legislative provision that would strengthen powers for national parks with respect to securing access. This is to do with core paths and particularly rights of way. We've put some information in our written evidence too, but that would be useful.
Thank you. Eilish.
Thanks. Yeah, I might just quickly give an overview of the invasive non-native species provision. So there's 3 key asks that we at RSPB Scotland and Link are really keen to focus on. So that's better access powers for Nature Scot when they're carrying out species eradication programmes of highly mobile species like stoats. A polluter pays principle for commercial forestry because currently Sitka spruce is invasively seeding across peatlands and into native woodland, and it consumes conservation budgets of both public bodies and the likes of the environmental organisations around the table, and better regulations for the release of non-native game birds, particularly in the context of highly pathogenic avian influenza.
Thank you.
Yeah, strongly agree with all of that. I think particularly for us the land use strategy and nature network provisions that Dan mentioned, because that's how you can balance some of the difficult discussions that need to happen. There's a real sense of urgency needed here, and giving a boost to the land use strategy will really help there.
Thank you. And Mercedes Villalba.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, everyone, for such a great session. In evidence that was given to this committee on the 5th of March, Lisa McCann, head of the Scottish Government's Biodiversity Unit, stated that the Scottish Government takes the view that targets are a key way to drive action. And I think what we've heard here today is that every member of the panel would agree with that statement. I'm just checking if there's any shaking of heads. No, everyone agrees. And in that same session, Ms McCann also stated that there is no simple way to measure biodiversity and that there's no one apex target. And I think we've also heard agreement from panellists on that point. And we also heard that of the 7 target topics that were identified by the Programme Advisory Group, only 3 are being taken forward in this bill. And there was a bit of discussion about the target topics at the start of today's session, and I just wanted to circle back to that on the basis that we are all in agreement of the importance of statutory targets and the need to tackle biodiversity from multiple angles. Ms McCann explained that the reason why 2 of the targets are not being taken forward are, well, on investment, she explained that the Scottish Government believes that there's a risk of potentially perverse outcomes, such as a risk of potential greenwashing, which came up earlier, and that she also added that there's already quite a lot of work going on across government to develop responsible private investment in natural capital. And so I wanted to ask the panellists today whether they believe that the Scottish Government can support the protection and restoration of Scotland's natural environment without public investment, and how likely panellists believe public investment in nature to be without a statutory target.
So I think, in my opinion, the funding landscape of the future will be blended. So there cannot be a reliance on purely public, on purely private or purely public. I think it has to be blended, and what we can't see is a sort of an idea that this is just a write-off, that if you invest in biodiversity and nature, that is pure expenditure for the public purse. This all comes back, you know, any return on investment on nature comes back 9 to 1, as the kind of the most recent estimates I've seen. So this is a very complicated picture. We have seen real terms declines in environmental funding across the board. So if you include all the different sources, so things like agri-environment and you know, biodiversity-specific funding, all added together, we've seen declines in real terms over the years. So I don't think without specific measures in the bill we'll see the funding levels necessary. And just to add to that, I don't think we'll get to a place where private sector funding is able to help support key biodiversity aims without public money. Something like the land use strategy is a necessary framework to allow that at-scale investment, because we know that the private sector is not really interested in investments of a few £1 million. They need to see the scale in order to make it worth it. So it needs to be both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Callum.
It's a really good question. This is something we're very keen on exploring. I completely agree with Bruce on the need for that blended finance. Just to give a marine flavour to it, only 1% of global climate finance is spent on the ocean, and the World Economic Forum has estimated that $175 billion of blue finance is needed each year up to 2030 to fulfil Sustainable Development Goal 14, and between 2015 and 2019 only $10 billion was invested in total. I don't have the Scottish figures, but it would be pretty much analogous, I would imagine. So one of the things that our natural capital specialist is looking at is blue bonds. So this is not my area of expertise, but that is something that really we'd encourage the Scottish Government to explore to help get some private investment in ocean recovery and the scale of ocean recovery that's needed, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that and provide supplemental. Thank you.
Yeah. Ria?
I was just going to add to that. I think it's also coming back to the point about accountability and transparency. So, for example, you know, whether it's blended or private or public, but if there are public subsidies that are being given to private bodies, what's being done with that and the outcomes of that need to be publicly available and accountable. So a comparable example is, you know, there's the Marine Scotland Fund. That's a public fund that is given to private individuals who, you know, for example, will say, oh, we want to try out new gear in order to test whether that's, you know, helps for climate mitigation or, you know, bycatch. But at the moment, there's no requirement to report back, and that information isn't publicly available. So I think whatever funding mechanisms are put in place, again, it goes back to accountability, publicly available transparency, and that, you know, if some of this is saying, oh, we want to look into the science of this, then that is available for other people then to build on that science and to move forward as well. So again, just ringing the bell of accountability and transparency.
Interesting question. I'd agree with Bruce that I think the reality is that we'll need a blend of public and private finance, but that it should be public finance that's leading the way. And I think we've got a really strong example of just how far public money can go in the Nature Restoration Fund and the successes that we've seen for nature for that, which is, you know, relatively modest in all things considered, but the actual gains that that delivered for nature and for people, you know, far outweighed the actual investment in that. So we can see more of that funding at a greater scale and, you know, with the right administration, then I think we can make a lot of progress towards targets and the other parts of this bill that we support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have we got time for another question?
Another brief question, and I'm going to bring in Tim for a brief supplementary.
Oh, is it supplementary on that? Because I was going to move to a different area.
Do you have a supplementary on this, or?
I think it's quite an interesting question, and we were out visiting Cairngorm National Park, I think the convener mentioned earlier on this week, and the subject of biodiversity credits came up. And I guess I struggle to get my head around carbon credits, let alone where biodiversity credits are going. But what impact, I don't know if you're able to answer that, but what impact will biodiversity credits have on this? Because, you know, that is going to be a significant driver of potentially private investment, is it not? And how does that work with biodiversity targets set on a statutory footing?
Bruce?
It has large potential. I really emphasise the public funding can't go away, but there is a real role for biodiversity credits. There's questions around whether, so you'd have compliance-based markets, so something around biodiversity net gain, or voluntary markets, and there's all sorts of questions around that. It's really in its infancy in Scotland, and the best thing I think we can do at the moment is really build the infrastructure so that we are ready. So just a really quick example, if you'll allow. At the moment, through the MPF4, we've now got EIA-level developments requiring positive effects for biodiversity to be shown by planning authorities. We have now got developers approaching NGOs and local authorities, private landowners, saying, where do we get these positive effects for biodiversity for? There's no slate of projects that can be invested in. And that's what we should have been developing with nature networks and through regional land use partnerships. So there are a bunch of projects that can be invested in off the slate ready to go. So we need to get this infrastructure up to scratch and quickly.
Okay. Mercedes.
Thanks, Convener. In her evidence to committee, Ms McCann also stated that the Scottish Government had not envisaged doing any formal public consultation on the regulations for the targets due to the technical nature of what is in the targets. I wondered if any of the panellists have a view on whether there is a need for public consultations on the regulations for the targets themselves.
Yep, Bruce.
Yes, there's a balance to be struck between expediency here and getting this done, but there definitely needs to be input into these. Particularly, we've seen things like co-design maybe not go fantastically well on some elements of the biodiversity framework so far, so that needs to be well considered at this next stage.
Thank you. Ria.
Yeah, I'd say you do need public consultation, and it's incumbent on a serving government to make that consultation as accessible as possible, because it will impact the lives of people. So in the marine environment, you're having things happening, and there are fisher folk or coastal communities who, A, weren't even aware of consultation and didn't understand how it impacted them. So it's really incumbent on governments to do that. If you're setting up a procedure, then it's up to you to make that procedure available to everybody.
Briefly, Callum.
Yeah, we'd absolutely support that. And just a quick supplementary to the previous one, we would like other industries that benefit from the public good of the marine environment to contribute to the Scottish Marine Environment Enhancement Fund.
Thank you. That's us run out of time, but thank you all very much for your very valued contributions this morning. I'm going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover in witnesses, and we'll resume at 11:35. Welcome back. Our second item of business this morning is an evidence session on the draft Town and Country Planning Marine Fish Farming Scotland Amendment Order 2025. To discuss this instrument, I'm very pleased to say we're joined by a panel of 5 stakeholders. We've got Sean Black, who's the Senior Scientific and Policy Officer for Aquaculture at the RSPCA. We've got Elspeth MacDonald, the Chief Executive from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. We have Mike Spain, the Director of Aquaculture from the Crown Estate Scotland. We've got Dr Ian Beryl, the Head of Technical from Salmon Scotland. And joining us remotely is Professor Paul Tett, a reader in coastal ecosystems from the Scottish Association for Marine Science. So thank you all for being here. Just to say that we did invite other stakeholders who were unfortunately unable to attend, and it is disappointing we don't have any representatives from our local authorities, because ultimately one of the major concerns is over the capacity of the local authorities to actually deal with this new legislation. However, we will carry on. We'll hopefully get some information from them before we have to make our decision in a couple of weeks' time. We've allocated around an hour for this session, and we have a few questions to get through. So once again, can I ask everybody to try and be as concise as possible with their questions and answers. And just remind you, you don't need to operate your microphones. Those will be done for you. So I'm going to open the question with a very broad question, which will hopefully set the scene. And the question is to identify the possible risks but the benefits of locating fish and shellfish farms beyond the 3 nautical miles, and to set out what is the current evidence base and whether the regulatory regime is good enough to enable proper assessment of the risks and benefits of siting these farms beyond 3 nautical miles, and whether it's in place before allowing the developments to go ahead. Anybody like to kick off? Ian? Yeah, I mean, I suppose the important part to start with is that the legislation already permits the salmon farms to develop in those regions, and this is a discussion about whether who the appropriate authority should be. In terms of that move and that appropriate authority, we think it should be local authorities. They are currently doing this job out to 3 nautical miles. They have the expertise. They have the local decision-making at heart in what they are doing. And overall, they're best placed, and they have a framework around which that can be done. So in terms of that, in terms of the benefits, the framework is there. The challenges for salmon farming is that we are slowly developing so that we can move into more and more exposed locations, which one might assume would be further offshore. All of our farms at the moment are within 3 nautical miles. But for us, it's very much about identifying the right location for farms and the right conditions. And some of those conditions may well be in 3 to 12 nautical miles. And therefore, the benefits are that we open up and we can move forward and essentially farm in those best locations for our fish and for the environment and for the wider stakeholders. You said that local authorities were best placed to do this. Do they have the expertise and the capacity to actually make informed judgments about the appropriateness of fish farms beyond the 3 nautical miles? I believe they do. In terms of the expertise, they have a framework which allows them to understand the pressures, to bring people together to have that decision, and to bring stakeholders who may support or may have concerns themselves, the framework that allows that stakeholder engagement. Of course, as we move further out, it's not necessarily a stepwise change. We should think of it maybe more of an incremental, and they are learning as we are kind of moving further into more and more exposed locations. So I think in that respect, they are. In terms of their capacity, we have... Obviously, I think a lot of us have concerns about the resource that they have. Where that sits within this discussion is a difficult one for me. I kind of feel there's a discussion around the principles and developing the right, or identifying the right organisation and the right body to be the competent authority, and then they should be properly resourced. I would say that regardless of whether this comes into place, the resourcing is a challenge already. Okay. Elspeth MacDonald.
Yeah, good morning. As the other sort of major food producers from the sea, clearly the fishing industry has some views on this, and it was disappointing, therefore, that the Scottish Government didn't actually draw this consultation directly to our attention. It was fortunately one that we spotted ourselves, but it was very disappointing that it wasn't actually, we weren't on that list of organisations who they had contacted directly. We have a number of reservations and objections to what is set out in this order, as you'll have seen from our consultation response. Primarily, we are, as I'm sure this committee is aware, very concerned about the spatial constraints that we're increasingly seeing in our waters as so much of the seabed becomes exclusively leased for other activities, whether that's aquaculture, whether it's offshore wind. The cumulative impact of that is squeezing our industry essentially into less and less space over time. So that is one of the concerns that we have. We also have some concerns about the potential safety risks to people in our industry from these new developments, if and when they become a feature in Scottish waters. From what I understand of them, they will be very large. Because they will be in water that is further offshore, deeper waters, they will need, again, sort of extensive and elaborate mooring systems to make sure they actually stay where they are put. Anything that is subsurface obviously creates a snagging hazard for the fishing industry, and anything above the surface obviously just creates an area into which we cannot go. We do already have challenges between our sectors when we have equipment from fish farm sites that sometimes goes beyond the site boundaries, floats free. We have sometimes vessels becoming, smaller inshore vessels becoming entangled with debris from fish farms, and that is a safety hazard for our industry. It would also be, I think, over time, we need to understand more about, how will these structures, which are going to, as I understand it, look very different from conventional fish farms as we currently understand them, what will be the sort of technical assurances about their robustness, their ability to actually withstand conditions further offshore. And I think, too, we have raised concerns about the fact that we don't yet know what the environmental impacts of moving this industry further offshore will be. We do have concerns not just with fish farming, but also with other structures in the sea, such as wind turbines. Do they actually present a network potentially for the invasive non-native species to actually come into our waters? Ian touched on issues around local authority resources. I think many of us probably share that concern. I think it is important that there's local input and local decision-making on these issues, but I think there are issues of not just whether local authorities are adequately resourced to do this, recognising that there are many pressures on their resources, but I think also there needs to be a recognition that perhaps some of the issues to be considered if these sites look at moving further offshore is that the assessments might indeed become more complex. So,
okay, thank you. Sean?
Convener, good morning, committee. From our kind of position, we are primarily looking at the welfare of the farmed fish in this case. So, really, when it comes down to the benefits and the rest, we're kind of focused on the fish themselves. And I think a lot of our questions are about the actual evidence base. There's obviously, as Ian highlighted, there's none of these farms already in Scotland, and there's very few around the world. And the evidence base as to the impact of the current speed, wave height, so on and so forth, is kind of unknown to farm fish. So I think from our point of view, we would really want to see either more work in other countries on this front, or a commitment, if this was going to be something introduced into Scotland, a kind of commitment from the government and the industry and other research bodies to actually focus research to farmed fish welfare. What is the positive impacts of moving them offshore? Is there less impact of sea lice, plankton, jellyfish? But also, what are the negatives? How are they impacted in terms of maximum current speed, impacting their ability to swim? There's some evidence about what is a maximum current speed that fish can, particularly salmon, can swim at. So we would want to make sure that any farms are not overly stressing the fish, because that's obviously going to have a negative impact on their welfare. And then I think it's other there's other parts around like assurance of what farms will do if these structures are offshore. And as Elspeth said, they are very large. How are farmers going to perform their standard husbandry practices? How are they going to ensure that the fish are in good health? There are probably a number of ways that can be done, but we would just want assurances about what does that look like? How are you going to perform welfare outcome assessments? How are you going to be able to lice count? So I think it would be more from our point of view a lot of the kind of what is going to be done in these farms. And at the moment, I think there's a lot of unknowns if we go into this. We don't have an opinion on the local authority issue. It's not within our remit to talk about that.
Okay. Mike.
Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Committee. I think it's important to note that Crown Estate Scotland approaches this not as a regulator, but in our role as manager of the seabed for the benefit of Scotland as a whole. As the lessor of areas of the seabed, we want to ensure that there is a robust and consistent regulatory framework in place to support responsible and sustainable development, and we see this as being in line with the Scottish Government objectives relative to the growth of the aquaculture industry more broadly. We're not qualified to speak on the scientific or the local authority issues, but part of my remit as Director of Aquaculture and Marine Ecosystem Services is to have an understanding of what ecosystem services might derive from this. And you mentioned shellfish in particular. And it's therefore useful to note that off the south coast of England, where there is, I think in Devon, an offshore mussel farm beyond 3 nautical miles, that is by the deployment of spat naturally from that farmed site, there is a regeneration of the native mussel beds which previously existed in the English Channel and which had depopulated. So there may be, subject to scientific research and confirmation, be benefits certainly from mussel expansion in terms of ecosystem services.
Okay, thank you. Professor, would you like to comment?
Yes, well, thank you for the opportunity to give evidence remotely. So the first thing I want to point out is that Sam's interest is especially in the west coast of Scotland, and the area of sea, which is already within the 3 nautical mile limit, is already very large. The 3 nautical mile limit, it goes from the coastal baseline, which goes from headland to headland. So it effectively includes most of the seas in the Inner Hebrides and around the Outer Hebrides and the Minch. The extension to 12 nautical miles goes a bit further beyond this. But we're talking about, on the west coast, we're talking about a very large area of sea. So within Argyll's remit, there'll be more sea than land. So that does bring to mind the first question: do the local authorities and the statutory consultees on planning have the resources and the expertise to deal with developments in this area? I think, as several other people have said. The second point I want to make is that we're dealing with an interconnected water body here. The sea doesn't stop flowing when it gets to the boundary of Argyll. Water flows from the Mull of Kintyre up north to Cape Wrath, up the Minch and around the islands. So that brings me to the other point I want to make, which is about the need for some strategic planning. Local authorities deal with operational planning in the sea. They give consents to development, but as far as I can see, there are no strategic plans for fish farming in the sea area other than those implied by the Scottish Government's locational guidelines. So I think, again, drawing on the comments that other people have made, that there's a need to have strategic planning for the whole of these sea areas, which will look at the requirements of all the sea users, which includes the fishing community, the marine renewable energy community, and agriculture. So in a way, to split planning between local authorities, Scottish Government and other entities, seems to me we're not getting the best kind of planning that's relevant here. So Our suggestion for approaching this is to leave planning consent to local authorities as proposed, but to consider further implementing the idea of regional marine planning partnerships, with the idea of a joint partnership for the whole of the west coast of Scotland, with the remit of the joint partnership being to devise a strategic plan for aquaculture and identify areas suitable for offshore aquaculture on the west coast. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That question is certainly a good opener. It's probably touched on every other question that we're going to drill down into. Make no apologies if you actually reiterate or restate what you've said and what could be regarded as opening statements. So I'm now going to move on to a question from Mark Ruskell.
Just before I move on to that question, I just wanted to get a bit of clarity from Ian. I mean, does the industry see this as effectively about relocation of salmon farms from the inshore to a more high energy environment offshore, or is it about expansion? Is it about retaining existing salmon farms but then expanding into the offshore environment?
I think, as I've said, we want to locate farms where they're most appropriate to be located, and in some of those locations maybe further offshore. In cases where we believe that farms within sheltered environments aren't better placed, that would result in a relocation. The discussion about relocation is very complicated because the consenting system is so difficult. But we are an industry who want to expand, but we want to expand into the right locations. We want to have the right farms in the right locations, and that's key for me. Just coming back to the concerns that people have raised here, I think, when we look at this in the round, they're legitimate concerns. For me, the issue here is that we have primary and secondary legislation which already defines the planning of aquaculture facilities, both salmon farms and shellfish farms, can occur out to 12 nautical miles. What we don't have is a clear, competent authority to make that decision and to have that framework about how the discussion and how these issues are brought together and appropriately discussed for individual planning applications. Without that, my understanding would be that any developer would then need to put an application into Scottish Ministers to decide without a clear framework. The planning framework allows stakeholders, such as those around the table and others, to bring those points together and have a clear mechanism to discuss those for individual applications and for that to be either consented or not on its merits or otherwise.
Okay. I think we'll come back to that in future questions. But Sean, can I turn to you then around the animal welfare implications? So I think you touched on what appeared to be a lack of evidence at the moment. So I'm assuming that RSPCA is not in a position right now to update your certification of salmon farming to then allow the certification of salmon farms that are in an offshore environment, because you don't have that data. You can't set the standards. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So we would consider offshore farming to be a novel technology, which means it's there's no standards that exist for it within our welfare standards for either Atlantic salmon or rainbow trout.
Does that mean that that if there was production coming from these salmon farms, then we couldn't buy it with an RSPCA accreditation from M&S or anywhere else?
Yeah, it wouldn't automatically. There could be considerations. We would want to work with a farmer to look at some research, but no, not automatically. Wouldn't be able to go on the RSPCA assured scheme, if that makes sense.
Okay. So then turning to those animal welfare impacts. So I'm interested in several different areas. I mean, firstly, cleaner fish, lumpfish and wrasse. I mean, they haven't evolved in that high energy offshore environment. So I'm interested in evidence and standards around that. I'm also interested in what you said about, salmon being in that high energy environment, what the implications could be of being reared in that high energy environment over a long period of time, and what you know currently about the welfare implications of that, and just effectively kind of what has already been studied.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of studies out there that are more broadly looking at, if we're talking about Atlantic salmon in this setting, about their maximum swim speed, what current speed that they can hold a swimming pattern in. So I think it's something along something about a current speed of 0.6 metres per second they can hold a steady swim at. So it's kind of anything above or below. You know, if the current is going to be above that all the time, that fish is going to become very stressed, and we would suggest that is suboptimal. I think we could all agree. But if they have the opportunity, if the current speed is below that, they're not stressed out all the time, so they could drop below that. But I think that's studies that are done in a kind of wider setting, because you could also get current speeds in very inshore locations like the Pentland Firth or whatever. So I don't think that's specifically for offshore, but it's just a consideration. There's a good paper from the Institute of Marine Research in Norway looking at the welfare impacts in offshore fish farms, but it's more of what research is already out there. But that paper's dated 2023, so obviously research was done before that. But I think there's still a lot of unknowns about, well, what happens with wave heights? Are there actually less sea lice? What is the impact of having a more, like a larger current? Is the oxygen at a higher level all the time? So I think it really, for our point of view, is just there's not enough research, and we want to see more, and a kind of cross-collaboration between different countries even, for Scotland to be able to...
And cleaner fish?
And for cleaner fish, I think we would just suggest that they should not be used in offshore farms. As you suggested, they are more used to much more inshore locations, and there are many farms, even in the kind of inshore, within the 3 nautical miles, that decide not to use cleaner fish because they are too tidal. Particularly lumpfish, I think, are not suitable for those locations, so they would not be suitable in high energy offshore farms, even with the use of hides and refuges.
Yeah, and then from the industry perspective, how easy will it be to actually monitor fish health in effectively an offshore environment?
Well, we have. What I should say is that
something about adverse weather conditions, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I should say is that the producers that are currently within Scotland are looking at incremental changes and incremental development to different environments. Companies at the moment have no direct, to my knowledge, plans to immediately move into that location. We need to learn, we need to develop the expertise, and we need to develop the understanding. At the moment, in terms of monitoring health and welfare, we have systems which allow remote monitoring on our farms already, camera-based systems. Our fish are effectively monitored on cameras and can be monitored at any point in time. These systems operate remotely if they need to be, but they're also operated with people on the farms already. That's the farms that we have in existence now. A lot of companies are developing remote feeding systems, which can be managed from a central location on a shore base, or actually in an office in a city, or anywhere really. So this remote work is already in place. It doesn't get away from the fact that having individuals on a farm is important. Very important for monitoring those fish. So we're already moving into that area where we understand and are doing increasing monitoring of our fish and their health and welfare on a day-to-day basis.
But you're not ready. You just said you're not ready to move into the
what I'm saying is that the operators that are, or the producers that are here at the moment, are making incremental changes. There are systems in Norway.
In the inshore.
Into more flush locations, more exposed locations that are moving further out, away from the coast. There are companies which have facilities in other countries, specifically Norway, which are in those locations at the moment, and they have some links to our companies. But at the moment, those that are operating here at the moment are doing this in an incremental manner.
Okay. Does anyone else want to come in on welfare? Professor Tet or anyone else? No. In which case, go back to convener.
It follows on nicely to a question from Elena Whittam.
Thanks very much, Convener. The question that I did originally have was round about the resourcing of local authorities to be able to undertake this work. And it was interesting to listen to Professor Tet when he was outlining the issue round about that wider strategic planning thinking and how this actually could work in practice round about regional partnerships, but I don't want to stray into other members' line of questioning. But I was interested to understand how, Elspeth, you maybe thought round about that, because obviously there's spatial conflict that would arise, but it's the complexity of how a local authority would be able to actually undertake the assessment effectively about, you know, what could operate beyond the three nautical mile mark. and how that would impact on your organisation and your members.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's clearly a lot of work, a lot of policy work going on at the moment around planning in our seas. There's a new national marine plan that's being developed. There's a lot of work going on there, and what that recognises is that there are a lot of different, whether it's business sectors, whether it's conservation interests, whether it's climate reasons. There are a lot of activities and policies that are impacting on our marine environment, and that the National Marine Plan that currently exists needs to be updated to accommodate that. So that work is ongoing, and obviously that will be a National Marine Plan for Scotland, but there will be a lot of sectoral elements that I would expect to sort of sit underneath that. So I think in thinking about how this particular issue that we're talking about today will operate, I think there does need to be thought given as to how it will fit with that sort of wider strategic piece around that, how you connect those local issues with the bigger part of it. I think this also sort of does touch slightly on a question that Mark Ruskell asked Ian a moment ago about, is this relocation or is it expansion? And I'd be also keen to understand a bit more about that too, because we have a question in our industry, at what size might you be able to move these fish further offshore? Do you still need sites in the inshore waters actually to rear them to a particular size before they're big enough or strong enough to move out into more sort of high energy areas? So I think there's all of these things that we are still yet to understand. Is this more sites? Is it replacement sites? And I appreciate what Ian said about this is sort of incremental. The industry here hasn't worked out how to do this. But I think there's a lot that we're talking about here today. It's very specific around these planning zones, but I think it does need to be seen very much in the context of what the National Marine Plan is going to set out, because that should be the thing that sets out the framework for our marine planning going forward. I mean, I'm not close personally to what specific activities that the local authorities do in relation to their role in consenting or planning consents for aquaculture. But I do feel that when you start to change from a probably quite well understood system for the local authorities who are involved with it in inshore waters and start to move this further offshore, the marine environment is different, it becomes more complex. Professor Tett has spoken about the fact that you don't get neat boundaries in the sea. So I think there is a question about not just about whether local authorities have got the resources to undertake this task, but have they got the expertise to do it, and particularly are they plugged also into that wider national marine planning framework that really should be the sort of overarching framework that all of this sits within.
Thanks very much for that, because the second part that I was going to come back to was about the expertise. So it's about not just the capacity in terms of resourcing, but whether or not those individuals who undertake that work in the marine space for the local authority and closer to shore activity, actually, if we think about high energy waters, etc., and understanding how a site could work in that place, is there the expertise? I don't know if anybody else on the panel. Yeah.
I'd like to comment on that, because it sounds a little bit like I'm an avid advocate of local authorities, but what I want to be clear about is that they are already dealing with a process and a framework which involves multiple layers of understanding around regional development plans, local development plans, the national plan. So whilst I'm not disagreeing that there is perhaps a requirement for specific plans at different scales, and those are in development, in truth, some of them are further behind, and that's for others to comment on. The structure and the framework that the planning system has means that planners, when they're making their decisions and sometimes making their recommendations to the local committees, have to take due regard for those regional, national and local development plans and structures. So they are already set up for this. And again, I think, although this is very much about 3 to 12 nautical miles, we need to also not necessarily see it in that way. We need to see it as a continuum of going further into more exposed or more further off the shore. And that just means that they may encounter different plans which require consideration within the framework that they've already got. So I think they have, putting the resource issue to one side, they have the expertise and they have the framework to do this already, so they are the right people to continue that work.
Just if I can maybe just come back on that a little bit. So as a former chair of planning, I really understand how the system works in terms of I didn't have marine in my planning authority, but if I can think about it in terms of the proliferation of wind energy and being on a planning committee and understanding that from the beginnings of that to how that rapidly expanded, and not just the members on the planning committee but officials as well having to rapidly increase their knowledge base. So it's just to look at it in that respect as well, that they are not coming from a standing start because they do have knowledge, but how do we actually ensure that if this does indeed go forward, that they have knowledge beyond what the capacity they have at the minute and that expertise that they're able to draw upon to make the best decision in a very busy space. I guess that was where I was trying to get at.
I think if I come back, I think, again, it's just about, and if I'm speaking out of turn, I apologise. I want to temper expectations that this isn't kind of, once this has been clarified, then development all of a sudden kicks off in huge swathes of the sea. This, as I say, is about an incremental process of learning how we can do this, learning about the environmental benefits and potential impacts, how we're going to farm our fish in those locations as we learn. So with having the competent authority that you can be involved in that journey, as we are already doing so, as we're moving into more flush locations further away from the shore, is really important. So I think, again, it's for me, it's not about that stepwise change. It's about having the legislation clear, the consenting system clear, so that everybody knows whose responsibility it is once we get to that point, but that getting to that point is not something that's going to happen next week. We need to work towards that.
Thanks. Thanks, Convener. It's just a quick supplementary, maybe for Elspeth to start with. We hear about spatial competition a lot, and and around the coast of Scotland, I'm interested to hear if there's any examples of planning and development in areas that have worked really well, that then we can learn from, use it when it comes to national and local, regional planning, for instance. Is there, any good examples that you can furnish us with?
I think probably there probably are some quite good, very localised examples. I think when generally people come and speak to the fishing industry earlier rather than later, that helps. So if say it's an aquaculture site or a seaweed farming site or perhaps an offshore wind site, the earlier we can start to have discussions about how can we put this somewhere that has least impact on you but yet still meets our objectives, then the better able we are to sort of find some accommodations around that. But I have to say these examples tend to be in the minority. We tend to find ourselves, fishing tends to be the thing that just has to sort of accommodate around other users of the sea. And one of the things I was thinking about as the discussion was going today was there's often one of the arguments that is sometimes put back to us about offshore wind development, for example, is that yes, well, you could sort of co-locate aquaculture with offshore wind. So, could you grow shellfish? Could you even grow fish? Could you sort of double up essentially the use of spaces so that two activities can happen in one place rather than have excluding fishing from other areas. And I don't know how practical that is. There would be all sorts of other constraints, I think, to consider. But I think my sense would be, to your question, that the number of good examples there are good examples. They'll be localised. They tend to probably be in the minority. But I know we are, for example, in discussions with a fish farm developer on the West Coast at the moment about how can we find, how can they want to develop a site on the West Coast. It's in an important prawn fishing ground, and we are having good and fruitful discussions with them about how can we try and do this in a way that allows both industries to continue to operate. We're not there yet, but the discussions are ongoing. So the key absolutely is early engagement, and I think a recognition and respect for both industries in trying to find a way through it.
Okay, thanks.
Question from Emma Roddick.
Convener, yeah, Elspeth, you've kind of touched on this, but obviously your sector has to work within this wider regulatory framework. How do these proposals actually align with that wider consideration?
Well, I think one of the things that, sort of reading the Business Regulatory Impact Assessment that accompanies this draft SSI, it was a little frustrating to actually not see sort of any figures in the BRIA. There was sort of no assessment. There was a lot of statements in the BRIA, but there wasn't an awful lot of evidence in it. There was a lot of assumptions made, I felt. And one of the assumptions being that they didn't foresee that this, the content of this SSI would have costs on businesses. Now, it feels a wee bit like dancing on the head of a pin here, but you know, Ian is correct in saying, you know, what this SSI is about who does it. But I think there's a bigger issue about, is it the right thing to do? And I would contend that expanding aquaculture from the 3 out to 12 nautical mile zone potentially will have a financial impact on our businesses. So I suppose it's more it's a knock-on impact on our industry of this regulatory change rather than a direct impact of the regulation itself.
So is it a wider view that the industry needs of marine planning? Because presumably marine planning could be very helpful for fisheries, but if it's done the right way and with that broader view rather than, as you say, kind of squeezing fisheries.
I think that point you make about doing it the right way is key, because we would contend that the existing National Marine Plan is quite a good plan. It just hasn't been well implemented.
Okay.
And we need to be careful that we don't spend a huge amount of time at the moment developing a lovely new National Marine Plan for Scotland that says all the right things and sounds marvellous, that's going to deliver great solutions for everyone, but actually either doesn't do that, or because the infrastructure underneath it isn't equipped to do that, or it simply isn't implemented well. So things on paper are fine, but it's about how these translate into the real world. And I think that's the, you know, the sort of proof of the pudding, if you like.
That's helpful, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Tate wants to come in.
Hi, I wanted to comment about resourcing. I think to my mind, the resource issue applies not only to the local authorities themselves, but also to their statutory consultees, the Marine Directorate, Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and so on, who have to advise local authorities on potential environmental impact and related issues. My view is at the moment that the consultees probably don't have the resources necessary to properly support local authorities in relation to offshore sites.
Okay. Thank you. Certainly, just before we move on to the next question, I know that as part of its work into the salmon farming inquiry, the committee recommended the Scottish Government commission research into the potential risks and benefits of moving fish farms further from the coast to more exposed waters. The government didn't respond favourably in that, but effectively said that it was up to Crown Estate, local authorities, SEPA, Marine Directorate and Statutory and other consultees to do that, but did agree there was the opportunity to look at the use of innovation sites to look at the impact, but that wouldn't be delivered until after a successor for the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre funding had been set out. So we may have an answer there to some of the questions. Tim Eagle.
Elspeth, you've pretty much answered this, but I guess it's just to any other thoughts on the impact on other marine users through these changes. So I don't know if anybody wants to pick up on any sort of further thoughts on that.
I'd be keen to just come in here, and I completely understand the issue of marine spatial squeeze because it affects our members as much as it affects anybody else for that matter. it comes down to the decision or the question about who makes the decision about any activity in any location, be it an offshore renewable development, be it whether fishers can operate in an area, whether a salmon farm can or an aquaculture facility can be somewhere. It's obviously, we don't have a clear system where one person ultimately makes that decision, or one body, because we have, as I say, these regional plans, we have a national plan, we have a consultation process that is ongoing, we have planning guidance. But for me, and I probably keep coming back to the same point, we need somebody or an organisation to be the point at which that information is all brought together in a legitimate way and considered with local views, with the views of stakeholders, and Elspeth and her members can feed in, other organisations that are concerned, offshore energy. They can all come into this one point and make that decision about, at that location, what are the environmental pressures, what are the other business pressures, and how do we decide? Now, for me, the discussion we're having, or that is being had here, and that you've been asked to comment on, is who should that organisation or body be? My view, again, is that local authorities are well placed because they have the expertise at the moment to do that. So I think that's where it comes down to. But spatial squeeze is a problem for every marine user, to be frank.
Okay. I think just to reiterate that, as I say, fishing increasingly feels that we sort of get the crumbs that we're left with that nobody else wants. When you look at the spatial needs that are coming from offshore energy, and there's massive ambition for offshore renewable energy, not just from offshore wind, but also we know that there's innovation and developments and ambition around tidal and also wave, and that might be, again, more in sort of inshore waters. I think it's also important to remember that within these sort of waters closer to shore, it tends to be where our inshore fishing fleet operates, and it's not so easy for them just to go somewhere else. The bigger vessels can go further offshore, they're bigger, they're able to work in harsher conditions, they've got a bigger range. But for our inshore fleets that are working in these sort of coastal waters, I think it's important to remember that they face particular challenges. It's not just so easy for them to go somewhere else. And again, I come back to the point I make. It's the spatial constraints are a part of our concerns, but we do also have real safety concerns about how the fishing industry can safely coexist with these developments as they move further offshore, because we already see real safety issues with our current coexistence in inshore waters.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Can I just ask a supplementary on that to Elspeth? What processes take place to consult with the fishing industry about all these developments that are going on, not just aquaculture, but because it feels like you'll be squeezed and squeezed, especially with some of the big offshore energy projects. I don't know if you can work in between them, but I would have thought not. Are you consulted? Is there changes made to accommodate your needs?
Yes, good question, and it links almost to what Professor Tett was saying a moment ago about resources not just in local authorities but also the other bodies that are consulted on these things, because we are consulted on certainly all manner of marine licensing applications, and it's important that we are, because we have to understand if there is an impact and how we can make representation around that. But it does eat up an enormous amount of our resources. You know, the amount of work that our organisation has to do now, particularly around offshore wind consenting, to try and protect our industry's interests is huge. And in the time I've been in this role, you know, we've had to massively expand the resource that we invest into this. Again, I think we see a slightly sort of patchy picture sometimes around aquaculture. I think some of the local authorities are sort of better than others at bringing us in early on. But certainly when things are at a marine licence stage with Marine Directorate licensing team, we are consulted. Again, we tend to find that we make a lot of representations, but it doesn't result in much by way of change. That would be the sort of usual position. So I go back to my earlier point about the earlier we are engaged, so as soon as, whether it's a fish farm company or an offshore wind company or whoever is thinking about a development in some place, the sooner they can come and talk, both to the local fishermen but also to us as the Federation representing wider interests. It's an opportunity for us to try and prevent problems happening in the first place, because that tends to be much more fruitful than us trying to effect change at the formal stages. But yes, it is a big resource requirement on us, both in terms of capacity and also expertise.
Okay, thank you. My substantive question is about statutory impact assessments and whether any of the panel have concerns about how they will apply or may not apply to aquaculture developments beyond the 3 nautical mile limit.
I'm not aware of any significant concerns about that. If I'm honest, if you could clarify exactly what you refer to with the statutory.
Well, we've had concerns. Well, some concerns saying that the impact assessments would apply beyond the 3 mile limit. So, and other feedback has suggested it wouldn't. So there seems to be a bit of dubiety as to whether or not the same.
I see what you're saying. I mean, I think that there should always be an appropriate impact assessment. We would always argue, you know, our members want to put the farms in the best locations. They want to put them in locations which, as much as possible, avoids, you know, conflict, or which is not always possible, but, you know, as much as possible. And early engagement, I agree, is a really important part of that. And there should be appropriate full assessments undertaken, regardless of whether that's in a zone up to 3 nautical miles or further offshore. So I would always argue that we want to go through the right process, ensure it's thorough, and if that requires certain impact assessments to be undertaken, then that's important to be done.
So just before we move on, the government's response to that, the government decided the strategic environmental assessment was not required, and also considered that habitats regulation assessment was not required. Do you have concerns around that? Elspeth.
Yeah, this was in relation to the consultation and the SSI. Yeah, I come back to my dancing in the head of a pin metaphor, because again, I think, if my recollection is correct, they said, well, these things would be done as and when an application came forward. But there was no, the government had scoped them out, basically, of doing them as part of this exercise of bringing forward this legislation, which I thought was, I thought that was a bit strange, because I thought that there should have been some attempt to make an assessment of that. I was also a little confused in just rereading some of the papers this morning about an islands community impact assessment, because it sounds as if there had been a bit of one but not a full one, and bearing in mind that a great deal of Scottish aquaculture is around islands, I would have thought that that was and we are looking here at impact on island local authorities, that would be a relevant point. So again, I felt that there was if my recollection is correct, it was simply that the government said, well, there'll have to be an SEA and an HRA as and when somebody comes forward with an actual proposal, but for this specific instrument, and what the consultation was about, that they didn't feel that was necessary. But I thought it would have been helpful to have made some sort of attempt at an SEA, a strategic environmental assessment,
it would sort of
community assessment.
Yeah, it would contradict what Professor Tett would suggested around the flow of waters and the cumulative impact. If that's not done on a far bigger scale, local authorities will be making a determination with regards to individual sites rather than that potential overall impact. Rhoda, do you want to come back in?
It seems to me that it's not altogether clear what regulation with regard to impact assessments would be required. So the information we have is that strategic environmental impacts would not be required, but wider environmental impacts could be considered. So it just seems that it's not very clear that given the 3 mile limit, that the legislation that applies further inshore does not maybe apply so far. And
I think there would always, so any development is always going to need to have an impact assessment, an environmental impact assessment. That's clear, and that impact assessment will develop over time, or will develop and change. It's location specific, but it has to consider the wider impacts. How is that development, be it a farm or be it anything else for that matter, going to impact its environment at a local level and a more significant further away from that development? So that would stand. That's the planning system that we have at the moment, and the planners would require that. There's been some question around how that impact assessment would change as we move further off into the 3 to 12 mile zone. I come back to my previous point that this is I look at this on increment. That impact assessment has to be undertaken now in relation to what is happening at that local environment and wider. And if we move the farm, then the impact assessment has to be adjusted in that way. So there will always be an appropriate level of environmental impact assessment. Whether the statutory instrument requires certain layers of assessment is perhaps one more for Scottish Government or the officials to make a view on. But in terms of any applications that come forward, they will always go through that detailed. And it's arguably one of the most detailed aspects of an application at the moment.
Okay.
Okay, Mark.
I mean, I appreciate, the competition between private interests, effectively, for use of the seas. But, I mean, the public interest in the room is really with yourself, Mike, as the Crown Estate. You'll be the ones that could potentially be leasing the seabed. So I'm really interested in your view about the regulatory framework that's being established here. I mean, as I understand it, SEPA's car licensing will not apply here. In relation to discharging waste, lice treatments, medicines. Now, they may or may not be necessary, but I'm just interested because you'll be leasing the seabed in the public interest. So how is that public interest being reflected within a regulatory framework which doesn't replicate what we've got on the inshore, which is some quite strict environmental limits and an involvement of a public agency in monitoring those? You've been a little bit quiet this morning. I'm just kind of, I'd like to hear what that public interest says about what we have here and how you actually manage private interest to make sure that the public interest in the environment is being protected.
Obviously, the regulatory framework is set other than by ourselves. Yeah. And as we are not a regulator, we have to take a step away from the regulations and how they are applied. What we do need to ensure is that before anyone enters into a lease, that they have fulfilled all the obligations and requirements of the regulatory framework that is set up. And what we would hope is that in the development of this instrument and any other future legislation, that a robust, transparent and effective set of regulations is put in place by those who are authorised to do so, so that when we consider the issuing of a lease, all those requirements have been met in full, because if they have not been met, there will be no issuing of a lease. I think it's also important to consider, as we consider the impact of this change, is the number of potential sites or applications that might come our way and over what timescale. And I think, as Ian has said, this is a transition. That's certainly the feedback we're getting. It's not going to be the equivalent of a gold rush of let's expand massively all at once, because there has to be a transition and understanding of what goes out. And I think that's where our colleagues in marine science have a very important role to advise. And I think in developing the regulatory framework, which, as I say, lies with others, they will need to rely very heavily on colleagues in Marine Directorate Science branch and also the likes of Scottish Association of Marine Science, which is part of the UHI Aquaculture Hub, and also, I would imagine, dealing with the Institute of Aquaculture at Stirling University. A lot of science needs to go into making sure that the regulations are robust enough to support a responsible, sustainable move, and only if those are then in place will we offer a lease which then benefits back to people of Scotland.
So would you say right now that the granting of a lease, that there is that robust regulatory framework as it stands to this statutory instrument, or is there still some way to go before you could confidently start issuing leases, knowing that that robustness is there with this regulation as you would expect it to be with all the other leases that you issue for wind farms, for inshore salmon farming sites, for kelp farming, for everything else?
Yeah. I must confess I haven't had time to read this in detail because I got this phone call to attend this committee whilst on holiday last week. So I'm literally back from holiday and into this meeting. So apologies if I'm not as fully prepared as I might like to be.
You might need to get back to us then.
I am more than willing to get back to you on that detail.
Okay.
So, again, part of the salmon inquiry, we were informed about the pilots of the single case flow approach coordinating SEPA's car licensing process along with the local authorities, and that was ongoing in Shetlands and Highlands. But the independent evaluation was supposed to be published in April. That's not been done yet, as far as I'm aware. We've also got the Scottish Government saying that in regards to SEPA's responsibility, that work is underway to consider how best to implement assessment and regulation of fish farm discharge between 3 and 12 nautical miles. Are we in the situation where we've got the cart before the horse, where we're looking to approve a SSI before the work's been done to allow those applications to successfully navigate that process? Ian?
I would say that's not the case. We have consenting bodies, notwithstanding the gap that we're discussing today, but we have consenting bodies who have responsibility out at 12 nautical miles and further afield already. It does vary, and in the area of environment, that's the one space that it does vary. So we have a consenting system which is complex, and that was picked up in the inquiry that you undertaken, and a number of strands around Professor Griggs's work, etc. But we effectively have 5 permits, consents, leases that are required. Although they do speak to each other to a certain degree, the decisions within them are what's material for the environmental licence is very much you need an environmental licence and you need all these other things. So to that perspective, this is a slightly separate discussion to who should be the authority for planning, because this is looking at planning within its own right, and then we look at the environment. But considering environment, if we look at the 3 to 12 nautical miles zone, at the moment the responsibility would fall to a marine licence. Now, SEPA would be a statutory consultee to that marine licence, and I have every confidence that those officials who would be required to undertake that assessment through a marine licence would have full dialogue with SEPA, and therefore SEPA would effectively be working hand in hand with the team assessing that through the marine licence. So whilst I appreciate that SEPA haven't at the moment got responsibility out of 12 nautical miles, that doesn't mean that their views and their position would not be integral to the decision-making process, and therefore they're kind of de facto making the decision for Marine Directorate. Under a marine licence.
Okay. Elspeth?
Yeah, I think just touching on your question, Convener, but also Mr Ruskell's. Mr Spain said a moment ago this isn't likely to be a gold rush, and that made me think really of what I tend to call the wind rush, which is essentially the ambition on offshore wind and the number of sites which have been leased for offshore wind development in Scottish waters, far exceeding the Scottish Government's own sectoral marine plan for wind, and indeed there was no plan at all for the INTOG sites. They are now playing catch-up with the planning, and we're expecting to see a consultation on the sectoral, an updated sectoral marine plan at the end of this month. So cart definitely came before the horse there, and I think there really is, I think, a regulatory gap there, because we've got now exclusivity agreements for significant areas of seabed for offshore wind development, lots of developers with lots of ambition spending a lot of money, and a regulatory system that is having to play catch-up because it wasn't designed for essentially the scale and floating offshore wind in particular, very novel technology, a regulatory system that really isn't there for it. We don't have a good understanding of the environmental impacts of offshore wind at scale. And I'm not saying that the expansion of aquaculture into waters further offshore is anything like the same. There's not the same sort of public policy sort of push behind that. But I think it is a parallel where you can see that there's ambition from an industry sector, also from government, for expansion. But there are gaps in the regulatory system. I think it is having to play catch up, and the plan is essentially being retrofitted now to what has already been essentially not quite at the lease stage, but certainly rights given to developers to do things. So I think there's something there that the committee might just want to dwell on, reflect on.
Okay, thank you. Evelyn Tweed.
Convener, could you summarise any concerns over the proposed boundaries and how they align with the Scottish marine regions used for regional marine planning?
Well, I think, as Professor Tett said, you know, we don't draw lines. It's very difficult to draw lines in the sea. I suspect he might have more to say on this.
I think, as I've said, we have a range of different plans at different layers that need to be considered. Ultimately, although I take the point that we can't draw lines, at some point in time there needs to be a line. There has to be, at whatever scale we're looking at. The discussion within the statutory instruments being discussed here is about where those lines are for local authority jurisdictions. Now, I don't necessarily have a view on whether they're in the right place, but what I would say is those local decisions, so we have the framework for decisions around whether there should be development, in this case aquaculture, but in other development, and those local authorities, I believe, should have a decision-making role, and therefore they need to understand what their boundary is for that decision making. So I thoroughly take the point that in the marine environment it's very difficult to draw lines, but I also say for local decision making, for regional planning, there has to be some lines, and therefore whether or not they've been drawn correctly I won't comment on, but I believe there should be lines to assist this.
Do you have any other concerns that have not already been discussed that you would like to raise now? No, I'm fine. I don't know if he wants to come back on that.
Yes, I think we're here talking today about, as Ian has described, sort of embryonic, I suppose, of next stage in the aquaculture industry, and certainly insofar as spinfish is concerned. But I think it's important at the early stages you also think about the end stages. So decommissioning of such structures, what's their life cycle, how long are they going to be there, what commitments will the planning system require for taking things away? Where does that long-term liability for these structures and all the subsurface infrastructure sit? Because again, from a fishing industry perspective, what we would not want to see is coming towards the end of the life stage of some of these developments, and either the site has been the company who developed it has moved on, or it's been sold, or whatever, and there is a lack of clarity about who is responsible for actually taking it away at the end of its life. So I think important to be thinking not just about what might happen now, but also that whatever regulatory system is in place makes provision for appropriate and safe decommissioning.
Yeah. I can maybe just say, I mean, I think, not in relation to that, in relation to your question, there is, we have not really delved into, and I think that's right because it's not actually part of a key part of this, but there is a challenge around resource within the local authorities, and I think that needs to be addressed in a separate forum, and it's been raised when this committee discussed and considered salmon farming more generally. But what I would say is there has been calls across the piece from every stakeholder involved in salmon farming, in our case, to improve the consenting system. And for a consenting system to be improved, it needs clarity. For me, this proposed change places or improves clarity in one aspect, which at the moment is a little bit murky. And therefore, if we can get that clarity, albeit with all the caveats that we're not going to rush straight to that area, I think that clarity is really important, so that when we are wanting to move there for legitimate reasons, for fish health, for environmental benefits, that the structures are in place to allow us to do that.
Okay.
Mike.
To the decommissioning point, which is a very important issue here, because the size and nature of the structures is going to be significantly different to be able to survive in the environment that is involved. And as the landlord of the seabed, we would very much take the view that it will be a condition of lease that decommissioning is taken into account as part of that, and we are investigating with our legal advisors as to how to implement that most effectively in this environment to make sure that we do commission responsibly, adopting the policy, as with oil and gas industry, of leave no trace wherever possible. And that's something that we're moving even onto our inshore waters, of trying to ensure that our tenants are observing the removal of all obstructions at the end of a lease. So that's something we wish to continue to see happening.
Okay, thank you. I think, Professor Tetlev, your final arm has ceased to be ringing. If you'd like to come in and make any comments on the Scottish Marine Regions, but also any other issues that haven't yet been raised and you would like to put on record.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, there are two things I want to say. I guess the first is about cumulative impacts. The normal environmental impact assessment looks at the direct effect of a new development on a site. But clearly, if in the long run we envisage a number of offshore farms, there's a question as what is the capacity of waters on the west coast of Scotland, in the Minch particularly, to assimilate the dissolved and the particulate wastes. And the advantage of being offshore is that the wastes are going to be spread over a much larger area, so individually they'll result in a low concentration. But we don't have a firm grasp on what the overall capacity of these waters are. So I think this is one of the tasks for regional marine planning. The second issue I want to bring up, and I don't think it's been touched on so far, it's from the point of view of the communities in the islands and in Argyll in particular. These offshore farms are going to be very large structures. They'll need maintenance, they'll need crane. The question arises of the port facilities that will support these structures. And here there's some scope, I think, for synergies with offshore renewable energy, which again need large supporting boats. So at the moment, I don't know if there are places in Argyll or the Western Isles which can actually have the port facilities to support these offshore structures, and that seems to be something that needs to be taken into account in planning. Again, that may be something within the scope of local authorities, or it may need larger scale regional planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sean.
Yeah, just two things. I think really want to reiterate that as part of this, I think fish welfare has to be kind of front and centre. The whole aspect of one of the aspects of moving fish farms into offshore locations is for fish health and welfare, but it's kind of a bit theoretical, and I think we would want to see more evidence of what are the benefits, what are the challenges. We talked about some of them and things like cleaner fish, but actually to get some empirical evidence down on paper, and that's something that all the stakeholders should be working together if we're going to look at this. And one other thing that hasn't been mentioned, not my actual area of expertise, but we do have a wildlife department as well, and it's how would these impact? We talked about spatial competition, but what is the impact on wildlife as well in these kind of offshore locations? They're going to be potentially affecting other species of cetaceans or birds, and there's a lot of talk about how that affects offshore wind. So it's just, what is that impact? I'm sure it gets taken into other impact assessments, but it's just to reiterate that there are a lot of things to take into account, and we have to make sure that they are all being taken into account, regardless of what we want to do at the end of the day. And we have to make sure that the regulatory environment supports making the right decision for all stakeholders, and that includes the fish themselves.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't believe we've got any further questions, so thank you for joining us this morning. Your evidence will certainly help the committee when it comes to consider and dispose of the instrument in a couple of weeks' time when we have the Minister in front of us. I'm going to suspend this meeting just to allow time for witnesses to leave before moving on to our final item on the agenda. Suspend this meeting. Our next item on the agenda is consideration of a negative instrument, the Disease Control Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Order 2025. Does any member wish to make any comment on this instrument? Emma Harper.
Just a quick comment on our briefing papers on page 29 in number 4. It says that this SSI includes an extension of the definition of premises to include those without birds. Is that purely for infection control and prevention purposes of preventing cross-contamination?
I think that is the case, yes. Certainly.
I thought this very question, but my understanding, because I was a bit worried about the broadness of this potential SSI, but my understanding is exactly that where there is, particularly if it moves into a mammal context, at the moment the regulations only allow it within the avian context. So this actually gives us the ability for a vet to come in and say, actually, we need to close down this premises because there is a risk that has now moved into X species, and therefore we need to prevent that moving forward. So I felt relatively secure, actually, that I don't think that would be abused. I would be very surprised if that was abused.
Yeah, that's my understanding. This is about ensuring that if a disease moves from one species to another, that the regulations are in place to allow control. Paragraph 5 will sets that out, whether it's avian origin. Okay, any further questions? No. Thank you. That concludes the public part of this meeting. We'll now move into private session and I suspend the meeting.